In a quiet military town along California's coast, a 13-year-old girl named Mary Louise Day simply vanished without a trace. But this wasn't your typical missing person case. For over 20 years, nobody even knew she was gone. The year was 1981. Ronald Reagan had just become president. MTV launched its first broadcast, and in the small town of Seaside, California, a young girl was about to disappear from existence entirely. Not just physically, but from all records, all memories, all traces of her life. What makes Mary Day's case so haunting isn't just that she vanished. It's that her own family never reported her missing. They never called the police, never filed a report, never even told the neighbors. For 2 decades, it was as if Mary Louise Day had never existed at all. This story begins not in 1981, but in 2002, when a woman named Sherry Calgaro walked into the Seaside Police Department with a question that would unravel one of the strangest missing person cases in California history. Sherry was looking for her sister Mary, who had disappeared when Sherry was just 10 years old. Detective Joe Bertina took the case, expecting it to be routine. Missing persons cases from the 80s were challenging, but not impossible. What he discovered instead was something far more disturbing. There was no record of Mary Louise Day anywhere. No social security activity, no driver's license, no credit cards, no employment records, nothing. It was as if she had simply been erased from existence. But the real mystery wasn't just where Mary had gone. It was why her own mother and stepfather had never bothered to look for her. The Day family had never been stable. Mary, along with her sisters Kathy and Sherry, had bounced between foster homes throughout their childhood. Their mother, Charlotte, struggled to care for them, and the girls were frequently separated. Eventually, Charlotte married William Hoole, a military man stationed at Fort Ord, and the family seemed to settle into a more permanent arrangement. But underneath the surface of this military family, something dark was brewing. Sherry remembered visiting her birth family years after Mary's disappearance, eager to reconnect with her sisters. When she asked about Mary, the response was chilling. Her sister Kathy pulled her aside and whispered urgently, telling her they weren't allowed to talk about Mary. The family had been instructed never to mention her name again. According to Sherry and Kathy, their parents had simply told them that Mary had run away. But running away was one thing. Never being reported missing was quite another. Detective Bertina began piecing together Mary's final days through interviews with her surviving family members. What emerged was a picture of an increasingly volatile household, where Mary seemed to be bearing the brunt of her stepfather's anger. The last time anyone remembered seeing Mary alive was during what appeared to be an ordinary evening at the family's home in Seaside. The family had gone out, leaving Mary and young Kathy at home alone. When they returned, they discovered their dog was sick and dying in the kitchen. William Hoole immediately accused Mary of poisoning the animal. According to Kathy's recollection, he flew into a rage, striking Mary so hard that blood ran from her mouth. That was the last time Kathy saw her sister alive. What happened next depends on who you ask. According to William and Charlotte, Mary simply ran away sometime during the night. They claimed she had done it before, so they weren't particularly concerned. But there were details that didn't add up. If Mary was a habitual runaway, why did William and Charlotte panic when they first discovered she was gone? Why did they never file a police report? And perhaps most disturbing of all, why did they continue collecting Mary's Social Security benefits long after she disappeared? As Detective Bertina dug deeper into the case, he discovered that the family had been receiving monthly checks due to Mary's biological father's death in an accident. These payments continued for years after Mary vanished, suggesting that her disappearance might have been financially motivated. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Bertina decided to search the family's former home in Seaside. He brought Kathy along, hoping her childhood memories might provide clues about what had happened to her sister. Kathy led detectives to a specific area of the backyard, where she remembered being forbidden to play. According to her recollection, William had explicitly told the children to stay away from one particular corner of the yard after Mary disappeared. When cadaver dogs were brought in to search the property, they immediately alerted to that exact spot. The handlers were confident that human remains had been buried there at some point. Investigators began digging, their hearts pounding as they imagined finally finding Mary's body. Instead, they found something else entirely. A small child's shoe, buried in the dirt where the dogs had indicated the presence of human remains. But there was no body. The dog handlers were puzzled but certain. Their animals didn't make mistakes like this. If they had alerted to human remains, then human remains had definitely been there. The only explanation was that the body had been moved. This discovery transformed the investigation from a missing person case into a potential homicide. Detective Bertina was now convinced that Mary Louise Day had been murdered in 1981 and that her body had been buried in the family's backyard before being relocated to an unknown location. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. The family's refusal to report Mary missing, their continued collection of her Social Security benefits, the forbidden area of the backyard, and the cadaver dog's alert all painted a picture of a cover-up that had lasted more than 20 years. But just as the case seemed to be building toward arrests, something completely unexpected happened. Something that would throw the entire investigation into chaos and leave everyone involved questioning everything they thought they knew about Mary Louise Day. In November 2003, police in Phoenix, Arizona, made a routine traffic stop. The vehicle had stolen plates, and when officers ran identification checks on the passengers, one name jumped out at them immediately. The woman sitting in that truck claimed to be Mary Louise Day. The news from Phoenix hit Detective Bertina like a lightning bolt. After months of building a murder case, after bringing in cadaver dogs and digging up backyards, after interviewing family members who seemed to be hiding a terrible secret, a woman claiming to be Mary Louise Day had just materialized 700 miles away. But the timing was more than suspicious. This woman had obtained her Arizona identification card just 3 weeks earlier, right in the middle of the active homicide investigation. It was as if someone had been watching the case unfold and decided to take action. When Bertina flew to Phoenix to meet this mysterious woman, he found someone who looked like she could be Mary Day. She was the right age, had similar features, and seemed to know basic details about the family. But something felt off about her story. The woman, who Bertina began calling Phoenix Mary in his reports, claimed she had run away from home as a teenager and had been living under the radar ever since. She said she had survived by using fake names and staying off the grid, which would explain why there were no official records of her existence for over 20 years. But when Bertina pressed her for details about that final night in Seaside, her memories seemed foggy and inconsistent. She remembered some kind of confrontation with William, and she recalled bleeding. But she couldn't remember anything about the sick dog that Kathy had described in such vivid detail. This was troubling to investigators. The dog incident was central to Kathy's account of Mary's final hours. If this woman was really Mary, how could she forget such a traumatic event? Phoenix Mary seemed increasingly frustrated with the questioning. During one phone conversation, she challenged the detective directly, asking how he would be able to prove who she was even if he found her body. It was an odd thing to say, and it only deepened Bertina's suspicions. The detective was convinced this woman was an imposter, but he needed proof. The solution was simple enough: a DNA test that would definitively determine whether she was Charlotte Hoole's biological daughter. Bertina was confident the test would expose the deception. There was no way this woman's DNA would match Charlotte's. Except it did. The results came back positive. Phoenix Mary was indeed Charlotte Hoole's biological daughter. The case was officially closed, and after more than 20 years, Mary Louise Day had apparently been found alive. But for many people involved in the investigation, the DNA results only deepened the mystery rather than solving it. Sherry Calgaro, eager to reconnect with her long-lost sister, invited Phoenix Mary to move in with her. Finally, after decades of wondering what had happened to Mary, the family could be reunited. Yet, almost immediately, Sherry began noticing things that didn't seem right. The woman claiming to be her sister spoke with a pronounced Southern accent, which seemed strange considering Mary had spent her childhood moving between California and various military bases. Phoenix Mary also claimed she had abandoned her real name years ago and had been going by Monica Devereaux. Sherry found magazines in the house addressed to this name, which seemed to support the story. But there were other details that bothered her. The woman didn't remember their father's inheritance, money that all the Day children were supposed to collect when they turned 18. This had been their shared dream as children, their ticket to freedom from the troubled household. How could Mary have forgotten something so important? Even more unsettling, she didn't remember the secret code word that she and Sherry had shared as children. They had called it Mohawk, and it was supposed to be their special signal if they ever needed to find each other again. Kathy, Mary's other sister, had an even stronger reaction when she met Phoenix Mary. Her gut instinct told her immediately that something was wrong. This wasn't the sister she remembered. The situation became even more bizarre when Phoenix Mary sent an email to Detective Bertina, claiming she had been lying about her identity. She seemed to be suggesting that she wasn't really Mary Day after all. Despite these red flags, the case remained officially closed. The DNA evidence was considered conclusive, and there didn't seem to be any compelling reason to reopen the investigation. But the story was far from over. In 2008, Steve Cercone, now Seaside's police chief, received another unexpected phone call. Investigators at Fort Ord, the former military base where the Hoole family had lived, were conducting an unrelated search with cadaver dogs when they made a startling discovery. The dogs had alerted to another location where the Hoole family had lived, a house they had moved to shortly after Mary's disappearance. Once again, the dogs indicated that human remains had been present at the site. This suggested something even more disturbing than investigators had previously imagined. Had Mary's body been moved not once, but twice were the Hooles systematically relocating evidence as they moved from base to base. Cercone felt compelled to reopen the investigation, even though the case had been officially closed. Too many questions remained unanswered. He hired Mark Clark, a retired homicide detective from nearby Salinas, to take a fresh look at all the evidence. Clark's review of the case files convinced him that Mary Louise Day had been murdered in 1981, and that Phoenix Mary was an elaborate imposter. He developed a theory that seemed to explain all the inconsistencies, though he admitted it was somewhat far-fetched. Clark believed that Charlotte Hoole had given birth to another daughter years before Mary, a child she had given up for adoption and kept secret from the rest of the family. When the murder investigation began heating up in 2003, Clark theorized William and Charlotte had reached out to this secret daughter and convinced her to assume Mary's identity. The motive, according to Clark, was the inheritance money that Mary would have been entitled to collect. By that time, with accumulated interest, the sum had grown to approximately $60,000. This theory would explain Phoenix Mary's Southern accent if she had been raised in a different part of the country. It would explain why she didn't remember family secrets or important details from Mary's childhood. And it would explain the convenient timing of her appearance, just as the murder investigation was gaining momentum. Clark also pointed to William Hoole's own words during his police interview. The stepfather had come tantalizingly close to confessing, saying that while he hadn't killed Mary, the demon inside him might have done it. In Clark's opinion, this was as close to an admission of guilt as they were likely to get. The retired detective believed that William and Charlotte had torn up Mary's pictures, thrown away her clothes, and told their other children never to speak her name again because they were covering up a murder. The fact that they had continued collecting her Social Security benefits for years only strengthened his conviction that this was a premeditated crime. But Clark's theory, while compelling, remained just that, a theory. He had no concrete proof that Phoenix Mary was an imposter, and the DNA evidence seemed to contradict his hypothesis. The case remained in limbo, officially closed, but unofficially still generating doubts and questions among those who had worked on it. In 2017, a new detective took charge of the Mary Day case. Detective Judy Veloz approached the investigation with fresh eyes and a determination to separate fact from speculation. She wasn't interested in theories or hunches. She wanted hard evidence. Veloz began by re-examining the physical evidence that had convinced so many people that a murder had taken place. That child's shoe found in the backyard, for instance. When she held it in her palm, she realized it was extremely small, far too small for a 13-year-old girl of Mary's height and build. The shoe that had seemed like such damning evidence suddenly appeared to be nothing more than a coincidence. She also took a closer look at the DNA results that had closed the case in 2003. Additional testing had been conducted over the years, and the results were consistent. Phoenix Mary's DNA matched not only Charlotte Hoole, but also Mary's biological father. The genetic evidence was overwhelming. But Veloz wanted to hear from Mary herself. The woman claiming to be Mary Louise Day was now living in Missouri, battling late-stage cancer. Her health was failing rapidly, and Veloz knew this might be her last chance to get answers. The interview lasted 90 minutes, and what Veloz heard convinced her that this was indeed the real Mary Day. The woman was able to fill in gaps in her story that had previously seemed suspicious. She explained that she had started calling herself Monica shortly after running away because she didn't want police to track her down and return her to William and Charlotte. Mary also introduced Veloz to a crucial figure from her past, a woman named Maury Kimmel, who had taken Mary in when she was just 15 years old. Kimmel remembered Mary as naive and childlike, someone who had clearly been through trauma but was trying to survive on her own. Kimmel's testimony helped explain many of the inconsistencies that had fueled the imposter theories. Mary had lived with Kimmel's family for about a year, one of the few stable periods in her adult life. But one day, she simply disappeared again, leaving Kimmel heartbroken and wondering what had happened to the young woman she had tried to help. The investigation revealed that Mary had spent decades moving from city to city, living on the margins of society and struggling with alcoholism. This transient lifestyle explained why there were so few official records of her existence. She had deliberately avoided creating a paper trail that might lead authorities back to her childhood home. Veloz also solved the mystery of why Mary had suddenly obtained that Arizona identification card in 2003. She had needed surgery to remove her gallbladder and required state assistance to pay for the procedure. A local nonprofit organization had helped her track down her birth certificate so she could get proper identification in her real name. The Southern accent that had bothered so many people also had a logical explanation. Mary had spent time in various parts of the country during her decades of wandering, and speech patterns can change over time, especially for someone who had been drinking heavily for years. As for that mysterious email Mary had sent to Detective Bertina, claiming she had been lying about her identity, Velaz discovered that Mary had sent a follow-up message trying to clarify her meaning. She explained that she had been confused and wasn't sure what she was trying to say in the original email. This was consistent with someone struggling with severe alcoholism and the cognitive effects of long-term substance abuse. The smoking gun in Velaz's investigation came from an unexpected source. One of Maury Kimmel's relatives had kept a photograph of Mary, taken at least a year after her alleged murder in 1981. This picture clearly showed Mary as a teenager, alive and well, long after she was supposed to have been killed. Velaz submitted this photograph to TrueFace, a state-of-the-art facial recognition company. Their algorithms compared the teenage Mary in the photograph with later pictures of Phoenix Mary, and the results were conclusive. There was a 99% probability that they were the same person. With this evidence in hand, Velaz submitted her final report and officially closed the Mary Day investigation for good. After decades of speculation and conspiracy theories, the case was finally resolved. Mary Louise Day had not been murdered in 1981. She had run away from an abusive home and spent the rest of her life trying to survive on her own terms. 9 days after Velaz interviewed her, Mary Day died from cancer. There was no funeral. The woman who had been at the center of one of California's most bizarre missing person cases passed away quietly. Her story finally told, but even with the case officially closed, some people remained unconvinced. Mark Clark, the retired detective who had developed the imposter theory, admitted that Velaz's report made him question his own investigation, but he couldn't entirely shake his suspicions. Steve Cercone, the former police chief, also found himself leaning toward accepting that Phoenix Mary was indeed the real Mary Louise Day after seeing the photographic evidence. But he remained certain that the cadaver dogs had detected something significant at both burial sites. The truth is that we may never know exactly what happened in the Hoole household in 1981. The cadaver dogs don't lie. As their handlers repeatedly insisted, they detected human remains at 2 separate locations where the family had lived. But whose remains were they detecting? Perhaps William Hoole was responsible for another death that was never reported. Perhaps there were other victims whose stories have never been told. Or perhaps the dogs were detecting very old remains that had nothing to do with the Hoole family at all. What we do know is that Mary Louise Day survived her childhood ordeal and lived for 36 more years after supposedly being murdered. She never had an easy life, but she managed to survive on her own terms, far from the people who had failed to protect her as a child. The Mary Day case serves as a stark reminder of how the system can fail vulnerable children. Mary was bounced between foster homes, returned to an abusive household, and disappeared without anyone in authority noticing or caring. For 20 years, not a single official asked where she had gone. It also demonstrates how conspiracy theories can take on a life of their own, especially when they seem to explain mysterious circumstances. The imposter theory was compelling because it accounted for so many odd details, but ultimately it was wrong. In the end, Mary Louise Day's story is not one of murder and cover-up, but of survival against overwhelming odds. A 13-year-old girl found the courage to escape an impossible situation and built a life for herself, however difficult and imperfect it may have been. She deserved better from the adults who were supposed to care for her. She deserved better from the system that was supposed to protect her. But she found a way to survive. And that survival was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The mystery of what happened to Mary Day has finally been solved. She lived, she struggled, and she endured. And maybe, in its own way, that's the most important truth of all. George Michael Zimmerman was born on October 5, 1983 in Manassas, Virginia. He was the third of four children in a family that blended different cultural backgrounds. His father, Robert Zimmerman Sr., a retired military officer and magistrate, was of German descent, while his mother, Gladys Zimmerman, was born in Peru and worked as a court interpreter. Their family is modest, but still maintains traditional values. From a young age, George was raised with a sense of discipline, community service, and civic responsibility. He was quiet, even withdrawn, in school. He struggled academically, but made up for it with a strong sense of loyalty and structure. After graduating from high school, he moved to Florida with vague, undefined dreams. He studied at Seminole State College intermittently, working small jobs, one as an insurance underwriter and another in a car dealership, before eventually settling into a role as a security officer for a gated community. He also volunteered with the Neighborhood Watch, viewing it not just as a task, but a responsibility. Friends and neighbors described him as someone who wanted to help, who sometimes took things too seriously, and who clearly admired law enforcement. George had, at points, voiced aspirations of becoming a police officer. He attended community forums, signed up for citizen police academies, and familiarized himself with Florida law. He wasn't in uniform, but he carried the demeanor of someone who believed he was serving and protecting. His past, however, included some red flags: an arrest for assaulting an undercover officer, a charge later dropped after completing a diversion program, and a restraining order filed during a dispute with an ex-fiancée. Nevertheless, George always considered himself a man of order and discipline. In 2009, he married Shelley, a licensed cosmetologist. The couple lived in a rented townhouse in the Retreat at Twin Lakes, a mixed-race gated community in Sanford, Florida. Though George lacked formal authority, he often took it upon himself to patrol his neighborhood, especially after a string of break-ins had left many residents uneasy. He obtained a concealed weapons permit and began carrying a Kel-Tec 9mm pistol. For him, safety was paramount, and something he felt personally charged to ensure. Trayvon Martin, born February 5, 1995 in Miami, Florida, was the youngest son of Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin. Although his parents were separated, they remained cooperative and respectful in raising their children, with a primary focus on their son. Trayvon split his time between his mother's home in Miami Gardens and his father's home in Sanford, often visiting extended family on school breaks and holidays. Trayvon is curious, energetic, and brings warmth and positivity to those around him. At 17, he loved playing video games, participating in sports, listening to rap music, and once expressed his dream of becoming a pilot in school. Trayvon sometimes got into trouble. He had been suspended multiple times, including once for the possession of a small amount of a banned substance. His family admitted he made mistakes, but pointed out that he was just like any other teenage boy still navigating the transition from adolescence to adulthood. While he wasn't perfect, he wasn't dangerous either. In February 2012, Trayvon was staying in Sanford with his father's fiancée, Brandy Green. His father hoped the change of pace would be good for him, a reset of sorts. Trayvon was familiar with the area, comfortable in the Retreat at Twin Lakes community. Like many boys his age, he regularly texts, listens to music, and calls his friends. One of those friends, a young woman named Rachel Jontel, would later say that Trayvon had been nervous that week, worried about a man who was watching him. George and Trayvon came from vastly different backgrounds, shaped by distinct experiences, values, and circumstances. Yet, On the night of February 26, 2012, their lives intersected in a gated community in Sanford, Florida. This chance meeting would spark a national conversation, disrupt a quiet town, and leave a lasting impact on America. What began as an ordinary Sunday in the retreat at Twin Lakes, a neighborhood of neatly trimmed hedges and uniformed townhomes, took a tragic turn. A light rain fell over the area, and the streets were mostly quiet. Behind this calm, however, tensions were simmering within the community after a string of recent burglaries. Nervous residents whispered about unfamiliar faces, and George Zimmerman, a 28-year-old neighborhood watch captain, took it upon himself to act. George regularly patrolled the area, logging numerous calls to authorities about suspicious activity. Armed with a legally concealed 9mm handgun, he saw his role as a protector, shouldering what he believed others would not. At 7:09 p.m., George spotted a young man walking slowly in the rain and called the non-emergency police line. He reported the individual looked suspicious and up to no good. His description, a teenager in a dark hoodie and jeans. Frustration crept into his voice as he added, "These assholes, they always get away." When asked by the dispatcher if he was following the person, George confirmed he was. The dispatcher advised that they didn't need him to do that. But George had already exited his vehicle and followed the young man on foot. The man George was tracking was 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. That evening, Trayvon had walked to a nearby 7-Eleven to buy Arizona fruit juice and Skittles. On his way back, with his hoodie up to keep out the drizzle, he was on the phone with a friend, Rachel Jontel. Their conversation was lighthearted, but took a worried tone when Trayvon mentioned someone was following him. Rachel urged him to run, and he did. Then George and Trayvon come face to face, a moment filled with uncertainty. By 7:16 p.m., neighbors began calling 911, reporting a physical struggle. In the background of these frantic calls, shouts for help could be heard, followed by a gunshot. When police arrived, Trayvon was found lying face down in the grass, a fatal gunshot wound to his chest. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Nearby, George stood with minor injuries, a bloody nose and abrasions on his head. According to George, Trayvon had attacked him, punched him, and reached for his gun, fearing for his life. George said he fired in self-defense. His firearm was still in its holster when officers arrived. George was questioned but released the same night. Initially, the case garnered little attention. The police categorized the shooting as a self-defense incident, citing Florida's Stand Your Ground law, which allows individuals to use deadly force if they reasonably believe their life is in danger, with no obligation to retreat. For the Sanford police, this explanation appeared sufficient. No arrest was made. However, for Trayvon's parents, and eventually much of the nation, this outcome was unacceptable. The events of that night and their consequences sparked an intense and divisive national debate. In the aftermath of Trayvon's death, his parents, Tracy and Sabrina, demanded answers. Why hadn't there been an arrest? Why was no one held accountable for their son's death? Their voices grew louder as they appeared on news programs, held press conferences, and shared images of Trayvon, a smiling, affectionate teenager who dreamed of becoming a pilot. Public outrage began to build, and the community became deeply divided. For many, this wasn't just a local tragedy, but a national crisis. Trayvon was young, black, and unarmed. George was older, armed, and had been advised not to pursue Trayvon. To a significant portion of the public, the facts were painfully clear. Trayvon's hoodie became a powerful symbol of injustice, Protests erupted nationwide, with students walking out of schools and marches held from Harlem to Los Angeles, all chanting justice for Trayvon. The Sanford Police Department faced harsh criticism. Chris Serino, the case's original lead investigator, expressed doubts about George's account, even testifying later that George could have avoided the encounter altogether. However, other officers disagreed, leading to division within the department and the broader community over the decision not to arrest George. The release of the 911 tapes became a tipping point. The background of the calls included desperate cries for help, analyzed repeatedly by experts. Trayvon's mother, Sabrina, identified the voice as her son's, while George's family claimed it was George's. Forensic experts could not reach a consensus. Still, the haunting sound of those screams gripped the nation. By mid-March, the pressure forced Sanford Police Chief Bill Lee to step aside temporarily. Florida's Governor, Rick Scott, appointed Angela Corey as a special prosecutor to independently investigate the case. Finally, on April 11, 2012, after weeks of mounting tension, George was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. During the announcement, Angela stated solemnly that they had not come to that decision lightly and that they had based it on the facts and the law. George turned himself in to the authorities and appeared in court, looking pale and expressionless. His initial request for bond was denied, but later granted at $150,000. Media swarmed the courtroom, while protesters gathered outside with signs, wearing hoodies pulled tightly. Inside, attorneys began preparing for a trial that would become about far more than just the guilt or innocence of one man. Evidence remained contradictory. George's injuries seemed to support his claim of being attacked, while Trayvon's autopsy revealed signs of a struggle. The trial will revolve around the perspectives and decisions regarding whose plea for help in the 911 call is justified. George claimed he was in fear for his life, while prosecutors argued Trayvon had every reason to feel afraid first. As the trial approached, Sanford prepared for the weighty proceedings. The trial would not only focus on George or Trayvon, but also ignite debates about justice, race, self-defense laws, and the devastating consequences of fear and suspicion. The courtroom became a reflection of the nation, exposing truths many sought to deny and others could never escape. At its heart was an undeniable tragedy. A teenager lost his life. A man faced criminal charges, and the nation anxiously awaited the outcome. On June 10, 2013, nearly 18 months after Trayvon's death, State of Florida v. George began at the Seminole County Criminal Justice Center, the courtroom filled with reporters, legal experts, and the families of both Trayvon and George, all watching silently. George, dressed in a suit and tie, sat beside his attorneys, facing a charge of second-degree murder that carried the possibility of life in prison. While his eyes remained fixed forward, the eyes of the nation were squarely on him. Was George defending himself? Or was he the one who initiated a deadly confrontation that could have been avoided? The question was complex and had no simple answer. The prosecution, led by Assistant State Attorney Bernie de la Rionda, argued that George was mistaken in believing that a teenager walking through his neighborhood posed a threat, and then pursued, confronted, and killed him. De la Rionda told the jury that the case was not about race, but about right and wrong, emphasizing that George's actions were wrong. Prosecutors contended that George, armed with a gun, ignored a police dispatcher's suggestion to stop following Trayvon. This decision led to the confrontation that ended in Trayvon's death. To support their case, the prosecution brought forensic experts, audio specialists, and key witnesses to reconstruct the events of that night. The jury was played 911 recordings, with the screams in the background analyzed repeatedly in court. Both Trayvon's and George's families were asked to identify the voice. The prosecutor asked Sabrina, Trayvon's mother, who she recognized the voice to be, and she replied, her voice shaking, that it was Trayvon. In contrast, Gladys, George's mother, testified that the screams belonged to her son, stating that she knew it was George, as she had heard her son screaming for his life. The trial became an emotional clash of perspectives. Trayvon's friend, Rachel, who had been on the phone with him shortly before the shooting, testified about his fear and confusion. Her testimony was deeply personal but divisive. Defense attorneys questioned her credibility, while others criticized the racial and cultural biases shaping the public's perception of her. The defense, led by Mark O'Mara, portrayed George as a man attacked by Trayvon, pinned to the ground, and beaten. They presented photos of George's bloodied nose and head injuries and called witnesses to corroborate his account. John Good, a neighbor, testified that he had seen someone in a dark hoodie on top of another person during the struggle, which matched Trayvon as the aggressor. John said that the person on the bottom had been the one yelling for help. George did not testify, following his attorney's advice. Instead, the defense relied on George's recorded statements to the police, which were played for the jury. In these interviews, George described Trayvon as the aggressor and claimed he acted in self-defense. He alleged that Trayvon had followed him, punched him, and slammed his head into the sidewalk. He stated that he had been screaming for help and had thought he was going to die. The defense aimed to establish enough reasonable doubt to show that George's actions stemmed not from malice, but from fear. Under Florida's self-defense and stand-your-ground laws, that fear justified acquittal. The courtroom atmosphere was tense throughout the trial, with emotional reactions from both families, jurors, an all-female group of 6, 5 of whom were white, carefully took notes and observed testimony. In their closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to rely on common sense, asserting that George had made a false preconception about Trayvon. De La Rionda argued that George had considered Trayvon a suspect from the start, when in fact he had every right to be there. The defense, in contrast, focused on the physical evidence and George's feelings of fear. Mark declared that there were no monsters in this matter and insisted that the only fair verdict was to declare George innocent. After more than 16 hours of deliberation over 2 days, a verdict was reached. On July 13, 2013, just after 10:00 p.m., George was found not guilty. Silence filled the courtroom. George showed little reaction as his family quietly embraced. Trayvon's parents were not present, choosing to avoid the emotional weight of the moment. News outlets announced the verdict to the nation, their tone measured but solemn. Almost immediately, demonstrations erupted across the country, some peaceful, others filled with anger and grief, all stemming from deep pain. The jury later admitted that reaching a decision had been difficult. One juror, known only as B37, shared in an interview that they had all wanted to find George guilty of something, but the law had given them nothing to convict him of. Another anonymous juror explained that George's fear for his life in that moment aligned with the case the defense presented and the legal standards they had to apply. The law ultimately determined the outcome of this case, but for many, it didn't feel like true justice. Nonetheless, the law had the final say. George was acquitted. Legally, the matter was closed, but the story, with all its pain, division, and reckoning, was far from over. George Zimmerman was found legally innocent and set free. But his real life was not the same. The world he re-entered had fundamentally shifted, and so had he. Overnight, he became a polarizing figure celebrated by some and condemned by many. In the years following his acquittal, George remained a controversial figure, frequently making headlines, not for his freedom, but for a series of troubles. He was involved in road rage incidents, domestic disputes, and public altercations. He sued media outlets and political figures, and even auctioned off the gun used in Trayvon's death. For George, freedom did not bring peace. Trayvon Martin, however, never got another chance. He remained forever 17, preserved in the final photo shared by his parents, his face youthful and his hoodie pulled over his head. Yet, his name became far bigger than his life. It resonated in conversations, classrooms, protests, and policy debates. His death became a symbol, not only for justice but for systemic reform. Trayvon's parents, Sabrina Fulton and Tracy Martin, transformed their grief into activism. They founded the Trayvon Martin Foundation to combat gun violence and support families impacted by it. Though their pain never subsided, they carried it with grace and turned it into purpose, demonstrating how dignity could exist in the face of profound loss. The trial's impact rippled across the United States. Trayvon's hoodie became a symbol of defiance. His tragic story sparked urgent dialogue about race, profiling, and perception. For many, his death marked a turning point, a moment when either something broke or something awakened. This loss fueled a movement, giving rise to a rallying cry, Black Lives Matter. Sanford, Florida, once an unremarkable city, became a focal point of America's ongoing struggle with race and justice. The police force underwent changes in leadership, and community initiatives intensified. Yet, the weight of those events never truly lifted. That night and its aftermath left a lasting impression not only on Sanford, but on the entire nation. Years later, the same questions lingered. What if George had stayed in his car? What if someone had stepped in earlier? What if Trayvon Martin had survived? There are no definitive answers, only pain, and the harsh reality that, in that rain, the encounter between an armed man and a black teenager forever changed the way America saw itself. Shirley Seitz grew up in northern Alabama, a region known for its small churches lining the roads and the sounds of gospel music filling Sunday mornings. She was raised in a working-class, faith-driven family that valued giving over taking and encouraged living life with purpose, kindness, and passion for music. From an early age, Shirley was captivated by music and ministry. Those who knew her spoke of her as a warm, charismatic woman whose voice could inspire and comfort everyone who heard it. Her favorite hymn, Amazing Grace, was more than a song to her. It was how she approached life. She embodied the qualities of an evangelist, someone who didn't just preach the word, but lived it, demonstrating compassion and service daily. Shirley not only kept her faith, but also actively participated in pastoral activities. She traveled to churches and gatherings across the region, not as a celebrity or famous singer, but as someone who connected sincerely with others. Her storytelling brought scripture to life, and her presence in the room was unforgettable. However, Shirley's life wasn't without challenges. Despite her deep faith, she experienced difficulties, particularly in her relationships. She had been married several times, enduring the heartbreak of failed relationships that ended in disappointment or disillusionment. Nonetheless, she remained hopeful and never stopped believing in love. Her family admired her perseverance in always seeing the good in people, even when others did not see it. By the time Shirley met Michael Vollschlager, she was in her 50s. Her children were grown, and she had recently inherited a significant sum following the death of her previous husband, providing her with financial stability for the first time. While she wasn't looking for a fairy tale romance, she sought a partnership built on trust, respect, and shared faith. Michael entered her life with charm and confidence. A chiropractor by profession, he had practiced in Florida and claimed to have helped many through his work. Known as Dr. Mike, he projected an image of purpose and refinement that resonated with Shirley's values. He shared stories of past struggles and emphasized his Christian beliefs. To Shirley, who had always seen herself as a healer, Michael seemed like someone deserving of redemption, and she wanted to give him that chance. In the early days of their relationship, Shirley appeared happy. She and Michael married after just 3 months of courtship. However, her family, particularly her daughter and brothers, expressed concerns about the rapid pace of the relationship and Michael's financial instability, failed past relationships, and lack of a steady job. Despite their reservations, Shirley asked them to trust her judgment. After their marriage, Shirley and Michael moved into a small house in Loxley, South Alabama, on a street with the charming name Camelot. For Shirley, the name symbolized hope for a lifetime of happiness. She sought to create a peaceful life filled with prayer, music, and visits from loved ones. Shirley supported Michael financially in the beginning, covering expenses for their home, furniture, and vehicle, viewing these as acts of love rather than burdens. Despite their initial concerns, Shirley's family tried to welcome Michael. They joined the couple for meals, family celebrations, and holidays. Shirley's mother Myrtle, her daughter Sharon, and her brother Ricky stayed closely connected through frequent visits and calls. Shirley had always been the emotional anchor of the family, making each member feel valued and appreciated. Her family treasured this closeness and wanted to preserve it. Even after she remarried, Shirley was a steadfast presence in her community, continuing to lead worship services and provide spiritual guidance to those who turned to her. She was rarely seen in public without a smile, staying true to the principles that had always defined her: honesty, humility, and forgiveness. Her conversations with family were often filled with scripture and warm words of encouragement. Even during difficult moments or when she felt overwhelmed, she worked hard to shield those around her from her struggles. However, over time, the family began to notice small but noticeable changes in Shirley. Her voice, once strong and self-assured, began to waver. Her energy seemed drained, and she spoke differently about her life at home. Although she never directly criticized her husband, small comments hinted at financial pressures or emotional fatigue. True to her nature, Shirley kept most of her worries to herself, not wanting to burden others. To her family, she still seemed like a woman determined to make her relationship work. A woman holding on to faith in love, despite having gone through 4 previous marriages. She still gives her time, resources, faith, and trust to others. Yet, none of them could have foreseen the storm ahead. Even as doubt began to creep into their minds, they had no way of imagining the tragedy that would soon unfold. On the surface, Shirley and Michael appear to be an ordinary couple, living peacefully in a small town in Alabama. However, behind the closed doors, tensions were escalating, slowly at first. Then, with alarming intensity, Shirley's family began feeling uneasy after her marriage to Michael. Their concerns weren't based on mere suspicion, but on clear changes they observed. Shirley, once vibrant with joy and spiritual energy, seemed to be retreating from her old self. Her phone calls became less frequent. She stopped visiting her family as frequently, and her daughter Sharon noticed how she avoided questions about Michael and their finances. Unbeknownst to her family, Shirley had been almost entirely supporting Michael. He had no steady job or reliable source of income, yet his financial demands continued to grow. Shirley used the life insurance money from her late husband to sustain their life together, paying for their home, buying him a truck, and helping him with overdue bills. What began as generosity on Shirley's part eventually turned into an expectation. And finally, an obligation. As the financial strain increased, emotional distance followed. Michael began pressuring Shirley for more money, and while she initially resisted quietly, her unease began to show. In conversations with her daughter and mother, she cautiously shared her concerns. In a phone call, she mentioned that Michael was very upset when she brought up the bills. However, her reluctance to elaborate left her family unaware of the full extent of the trouble. The last time Shirley was seen alive was March 21, 2010. That night, during their conversation, she told her daughter Sharon that she loved her, without any urgency. The following day, she stopped answering her phone, which was unlike her. Sharon grew anxious. Her mother never went silent without reason. When Ricky, Shirley's brother, went to her house to check on her, Michael met him outside, calm and composed. Michael claimed Shirley had left with a friend for a spiritual retreat, but something felt wrong. The house was unnervingly quiet. Shirley's purse and phone were inside. Her car was still in the driveway, and Michael, while outwardly calm, showed no genuine concern. Alarmed, the family reported Shirley missing within hours. The Loxley Police Department launched an investigation. Officers searched the house, the nearby woods, and pressed Michael for answers. His story quickly unraveled. Initially, he said Shirley had gone out alone. Later, he claimed she had left with someone from church, but he couldn't name anyone or explain why her belongings had been left behind. The inconsistencies raised suspicion, and investigators began digging into Michael's background. What they uncovered painted a disturbing picture. Michael had a history of deception and exploitation. Court records revealed a string of failed relationships, financial troubles, and manipulative behavior. His past wives had accused him of fraud, emotional abuse, and even making threats. Shirley seemed to have fallen for his charm, only to end up as the latest victim in a disturbing pattern. As the investigation escalated, police used cadaver dogs to search the property. On March 24th, 3 days after Shirley vanished, the dogs led officers to a shallow grave behind her and Michael's home. Upon digging, investigators unearthed a tarp. Beneath it, wrapped tightly in layers of plastic, lay the body of Shirley. Her face had been covered in duct tape, and her body showed signs of restraint. The autopsy concluded that her death was caused by asphyxiation. This was no accident. It was intentional. The crime scene revealed a chilling story. Shirley's disappearance wasn't straightforward. She was murdered in her own home, likely on the night she last spoke with her daughter. Her body was buried just feet from the house where she had once sung gospel hymns and prayed for peace. Michael was arrested immediately. During his initial interview, he denied any involvement. He claimed ignorance, suggested someone else was responsible, and argued he was being framed. However, the evidence told a different story. Investigators uncovered signs of a struggle inside the home. Blood found in the bedroom and hallway matched Shirley's. The duct tape discovered on her face was identical to a roll found in the garage. Cell phone records placed Michael near the burial site in the early morning hours following her disappearance. Further investigation revealed a motive. Shirley had recently confronted Michael about financial issues. she had begun to assert herself, talking about cutting off money and needing space. Michael, fearing the loss of his home, truck, and financial security, snapped. Police believed greed drove him. He had grown accustomed to the comforts Shirley's generosity provided. When she started resisting, he saw no way forward except to eliminate her. The arrest left the small town in shock. Neighbors who once exchanged pleasantries with Michael now spoke to reporters. Church friends wept. Shirley, a woman known for her kindness and service, had been killed by the very man she tried to love and support. In the aftermath, more of Shirley's loved ones came forward. Some recalled seeing unexplained bruises she dismissed. Others mentioned that they had heard her say she didn't want to fight anymore, but had assumed she was referring to verbal arguments. No one had imagined it would escalate to that. The district attorney acted swiftly, assembling a case that painted Michael as calculating and manipulative. They gathered digital evidence, financial records, and statements from his former spouses. A disturbing pattern emerged: a man who used charm, faith, and emotional neediness to exploit vulnerable women, draining them financially and emotionally. In Shirley's case, the outcome was deadly. Michael's trial began in Baldwin County, Alabama, gripping the small community with disbelief and anger. Once seen smiling in family photos with Shirley, Michael now stood accused of first-degree murder. Prosecutors focused their strategy on proving intent, motive, and premeditation. Every detail, they argued, demonstrated that the crime was deliberate. The timeline was critical. Prosecutors outlined how Shirley was last heard from on March 21, 2010. Her car, purse, and phone were left behind. Michael's accounts of her disappearance were riddled with inconsistencies. Detectives testified about the grave, describing it as hastily dug and shallow but deliberately hidden under a blue tarp and littered with debris. Medical experts confirmed Shirley's death resulted from asphyxiation, likely due to the duct tape wrapped around her face. Gruesome crime scene photos were shown in court, depicting Shirley's bound and wrapped body buried close to her home. The images were unbearable for her family, with some leaving the courtroom, while others silently leaned on one another for support. Financial records presented by the prosecution revealed that Shirley had been funding Michael's lifestyle, covering expenses like the mortgage and his truck. Her daughter Sharon and brother Ricky testified that Shirley had grown increasingly frustrated in the weeks before her death. She had started setting boundaries, saying no more often, and shared that she was contemplating changes in her life. Prosecutors argued that these actions triggered Michael's fear of losing his financial support, leading him to commit murder out of desperation. This case struck the core of the close-knit community, as neighbors mourned the loss of Shirley, generous, loving, and undeserving of what happened. Michael's defense team presented an alternative perspective. While they didn't dispute that Shirley was dead or that her body was discovered on Michael's property, they argued that her death wasn't premeditated. They claimed the tragedy resulted from an argument that spiraled out of control, causing Michael to act out of panic rather than calculated intent. They sought to depict him as an emotionally distraught man, overwhelmed and desperate, rather than a deliberate murderer. However, the jury also heard testimony from Michael's former spouses, which painted a vastly different and more disturbing picture. Two women described a history of manipulation in Michael's past relationships, including financial control, emotional abuse, and subtle threats. While the court carefully limited the scope of these testimonies, they underscored a consistent narrative. Michael appeared outwardly charming, but behaved very differently in private. Michael chose not to testify in his defense, leaving his legal team to rely solely on cross-examination and closing arguments to raise doubt. Ultimately, the evidence was overwhelming, the inconsistencies impossible to ignore, and the tragedy undeniable. After only a few hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its decision. Michael Wollschläger was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For Shirley's family, the verdict brought some measure of justice, but no peace. No ruling could reverse the events or bring Shirley back. The courtroom offered something the family had sought since her disappearance: certainty. In that moment, they knew what had happened, even if it couldn't undo their loss. In Loxley, Alabama, a quiet, close-knit community, life eventually returned to its regular pace. Yet Shirley's absence left a void that could never be filled. Her death cast a long shadow over the town she had once served so faithfully. Her voice, once a source of praise and worship, lived on only in the memories of those who loved her. Shirley's family bore a layered grief. There was the pain of losing a mother, younger sister, and daughter. But there was also the agony of hindsight. They had felt uneasy about her quick marriage to Michael, worried about her silences, and ignored instincts that something was wrong. Despite all this, Shirley had never asked for help, a fact that haunted them deeply. She had always been the one others leaned on for support, for strength, and when she needed help herself, she chose to carry the burden alone. Shirley's daughter, Sharon, who used to call her mother daily, later admitted that she wished she had tried harder to visit earlier. However, her mom always gave the impression that everything was fine, even when it wasn't. Sharon's words expressed a poignant pain shared by many families of victims, a mix of loss and helplessness. In the churches where Shirley once led congregations in song, vigils were held in her memory. Beneath her photograph, candles flickered as pastors spoke of forgiveness, strength, and justice. They also stressed vigilance, warning how evil can often disguise itself with charm and kindness. Michael Wollschläger would spend the rest of his life behind bars, with no chance of parole or appeals to undo his actions. While legal justice was served, the deeper wound, the loss of Shirley and all she brought to the world, remained unhealed. Shirley lived her life rooted in faith, believing in redemption, second chances, and the goodness of others. Ironically, it was this unwavering trust that cost her everything. But it also defined her legacy. For those who loved her, it was this light, her faith, resilience, and quiet strength that they carried forward. Imagine living in a place where everyone knows your name, where Friday night football games bring the whole town together, and the biggest worry is whether Mrs. Henderson's apple pie will win first place at the county fair again. A place where kids ride their bikes until the streetlights come on, and parents never think twice about letting them walk to school alone. This was Acme, Washington, in 1989. A tiny logging community nestled in the shadow of the North Cascade Mountains, where trust wasn't just expected, it was a way of life. The kind of place where folks still left their doors unlocked and helped their neighbors without being asked. But sometimes, the most peaceful places harbor the darkest secrets. And sometimes, evil finds its way into paradise. On a crisp November morning in 1989, that peace would be shattered forever. A young woman's life would be stolen, a family would be destroyed, and an entire community would discover that safety is just an illusion. This is the story of Mandy Stavik, and the case that haunted a small town for nearly 3 decades. 18-year-old Amanda Stavik was everything you'd want in a daughter. Bright, athletic, Ambitious, the kind of girl who lit up every room she entered. She'd been the star of her high school basketball team, a cheerleader, and one of the top students in her graduating class. Everyone called her Mandy, and everyone loved her. After graduating from Mount Baker High School, Mandy had headed off to Central Washington University with dreams of becoming a commercial airline pilot. It was an ambitious goal for a young woman in the late 80s, but those who knew Mandy weren't surprised. She'd always been determined to reach for the sky. Thanksgiving weekend 1989 found Mandy back home in Acme, taking a break from her freshman year of college. She was excited to spend time with her family, catch up with old friends, and enjoy the familiar comfort of the place she'd grown up. The day after Thanksgiving, November 24th, dawned clear and cold. It was the kind of crisp autumn day that made you want to get outside and breathe in the mountain air. For Mandy, who'd been a runner throughout high school, it was the perfect morning for a jog. She'd developed a routine during her years at Mount Baker High. Almost every day, she'd lace up her running shoes, clip a leash on her German Shepherd Kira, and head out onto the rural roads that wound through the countryside around Acme. It was her time to think, to clear her head, and to stay in the kind of shape that had made her such a formidable athlete. That Friday morning was no different. Mandy pulled on her running clothes, said goodbye to her family, and headed out with Kira by her side. She planned to follow her usual route, a path that would take her along Strand Road, past farmhouses and wooded areas, through the heart of the community she called home. It should have been just another run, but Mandy Stavik would never make it home. Hours passed, then more hours. As the afternoon wore on and evening approached, Mandy's family began to worry. She was responsible, reliable, not the type to disappear without explanation. When darkness fell and she still hadn't returned, they knew something was terribly wrong. The search began immediately. Friends, neighbors, family members, everyone who could help, fanned out across the rural roads and forest trails around Acme. They called her name until their voices were hoarse. They searched with flashlights long into the night. Kira, Mandy's faithful German shepherd, had returned home alone earlier that day. The dog was agitated, pacing nervously, as if trying to communicate something she couldn't express. But where was Mandy? For 3 agonizing days, the search continued. Volunteers scoured every inch of the countryside. Helicopters circled overhead. Boats searched the rivers and streams that cut through the landscape. The entire community came together, united in their desperate hope to bring Mandy home safely. But hope turned to horror on November 27th. Detective Ron Peterson was part of the search team that day. He'd been methodically working his way along the south fork of the Nooksack River in his Zodiac boat when something caught his eye. There, in a quiet side channel away from the main river, he spotted something pink floating in the dark water. It was Mandy. The discovery sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community. This wasn't supposed to happen in Acme. This wasn't supposed to happen anywhere, but especially not here, in their safe haven tucked away from the troubles of the wider world. As investigators began to piece together what had happened, a terrifying picture emerged. Mandy hadn't simply had an accident. She hadn't gotten lost or fallen into the river. Someone had deliberately taken her life. The evidence suggested that Mandy had been abducted while out on her run, likely by someone in a vehicle. She was too fast a runner to be caught on foot. Investigators reasoned her attacker had probably used a weapon to force her compliance, then taken her to a location several miles from her jogging route. What happened next was every parent's worst nightmare. Mandy had been sexually assaulted, but she hadn't given up without a fight. Scratches on her arms and legs suggested she'd tried to escape. running through blackberry bushes in a desperate attempt to get away from her attacker. In the end, her efforts weren't enough. Her killer had caught up with her, knocked her unconscious, and then placed her in the river to ensure she wouldn't survive. For Detective Peterson, who had children of his own, the case was deeply personal. As he recovered Mandy's body from the cold water, he whispered words that no parent should ever have to say. The memory of that moment would stay with him for the rest of his life. The investigation that followed was intense and thorough. Tips poured in from concerned citizens. Police interviewed dozens of potential suspects. They looked at everyone from local drifters to Mandy's own boyfriend, methodically working to rule out each possibility. One early person of interest was David Succi, a transient who'd been seen in the area on the day of Mandy's disappearance. But when investigators obtained his DNA, it didn't match evidence found at the crime scene. In fact, despite collecting DNA samples from 30 different men in the area, investigators came up empty. None of the samples matched. The case that had started with such promise, with physical evidence that should have led directly to the killer, suddenly hit a brick wall as months turned to years. The Mandy Stavik case began to go cold. The detective assigned to it would change. Files would be boxed up and stored away. The daily urgency that had driven the investigation would fade, but the impact on the community never did. In a place like Acme, everyone knew everyone. Mandy's murder didn't just take away a beloved daughter, sister, and friend. It stole something more fundamental, the sense of security that had defined life in this small town. Parents who had never worried about their children playing outside after dark suddenly found themselves checking locks twice before bed. Runners who had felt safe on the rural roads began looking over their shoulders. The easy trust that had been the foundation of community life was replaced by a nagging fear that the killer was still out there, still among them. Years passed, a decade, then another. The case remained officially open, but with each passing year, it seemed less likely that justice would ever be served. Mandy's family never stopped hoping, never stopped asking questions, but even they began to wonder if they would ever know the truth about what happened to their daughter. 25 years would pass before everything changed. 25 years before a casual conversation at a water park would crack the case wide open. 25 years before the people of Acme would finally learn that the monster they'd feared was someone they'd known all along. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source imaginable. Two mothers, sitting on the grass at a local water park, watching their children splash down slides and play in the summer sun. They barely knew each other, these women, Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson, but they shared a connection that went back decades to their high school years at Mount Baker High. It was June 2013, and somehow the conversation turned to Mandy Stavik. Maybe it was the way the sunlight caught the water, or the sound of children laughing, that made them think of innocence lost, whatever prompted it. When Mandy's name came up, both women felt something stir inside them, a recognition, a shared suspicion they'd carried in silence for far too long. I just turned to Marilee and said, "Well, I'm sure I know who killed her," Heather would later recall. And she turned to me and said, "Oh, I do too." The name that came from both their lips was Timothy Bass. Tim Bass had been just another face in the halls of Mount Baker High School back in the late 80s. He wasn't particularly memorable, not a star athlete, not a troublemaker, not someone who stood out in any obvious way. He was just there, part of the background of small-town life. But for both Heather and Marilee, Tim Bass had been anything but forgettable. Each woman had experienced encounters with him that had left them deeply unsettled. Encounters they'd never spoken about publicly, but had never been able to shake. For Heather, the memory went back to the summer of 1989, just months before Mandy's murder. She was 15 years old, sitting in a friend's truck after a softball game, when Tim Bass, then in his 20s, climbed in beside her. What started as casual conversation quickly turned uncomfortable. He began talking about her eyes, telling her how beautiful they were. Then he picked up a pen from the cup holder and began running it along her knees as she sat there in her cut-off sweatpants. She was just a teenager, trapped in a vehicle with an older man whose attention felt predatory and wrong. I was very nervous. She would remember years later. The incident had stayed with her, a moment of vulnerability and fear that she'd carried in silence. But Marilee's story was even more chilling. It was July 1991, nearly 2 years after Mandy's death. Marilee was at home alone with her young son when she heard a knock at her door. When she opened it, there stood Tim Bass, claiming he'd been hunting all day and needed to use her phone to call his wife. Something about his presence made her uncomfortable, but she let him in. When she handed him the phone, he dialed a number, but all they heard was the electronic beeping that indicated the call couldn't be completed. The number was disconnected or had never existed at all. Then, Tim's behavior became truly frightening. He walked through her kitchen toward her bedroom, making himself at home in her private space. He told her he used to drive by her house, that he'd always been in love with her, that he wanted to make love to her right then and there. Marilee was terrified. Here was a man who had inserted himself into her home under false pretenses, who was now making sexual advances while her child was nearby. She demanded that he leave, but he refused. Only when she threatened to call the police did he finally go. For more than 20 years, both women had carried these experiences alone, in a small town. Accusing someone of something you couldn't prove was dangerous. Reputations mattered. Families had to live together in the same community. Speaking up without absolute certainty felt impossible. But sitting there in that water park, watching their own children play, they realized they couldn't stay silent any longer. If their suspicions were right, if Tim Bass had killed Mandy Stavik, then their silence was protecting a murderer. They reached out to law enforcement, sharing their stories with Detective Ken Gates, another Mount Baker High graduate who understood the dynamics of their small community. The information was intriguing, but it wasn't evidence. After 24 years, police needed more than suspicions and uncomfortable memories. What they discovered when they began looking into Tim Bass was a man who had been hiding in plain sight all along. For the past quarter century, while Mandy's family grieved and the community lived in fear, Tim Bass had been living a quiet, seemingly normal life just miles from where the murder had taken place. He'd gotten married just 6 weeks after Mandy's death, settled down with his wife Gina, and had 3 children. He worked as a delivery driver for a local bakery, making his rounds through the very communities that had been searching for Mandy's killer. He had no significant criminal record. He kept to himself, went to work, came home. To all outward appearances, he was just another small-town family man living an unremarkable life. But the most shocking discovery was where he'd been living in 1989. Tim Bass's family home sat less than 2 miles from Mandy's house, right along one of her regular jogging routes. If he'd been looking out his window on any given day, he could have watched her run past. He could have learned her patterns, her timing, her routine. When police finally approached Bass in 2013, his behavior immediately raised red flags. Asked about Mandy Stavik, he pretended not to remember her at first. Mandy, he said. as if searching his memory. Oh yeah, she was a girl that they found in the river. Who could forget Mandy Stavik in a community the size of Acme? Her murder had been the defining tragedy of their generation. For someone who'd attended the same high school, lived in the same area, to claim he barely remembered her seemed absurd. When investigators asked Bass for a DNA sample, his refusal was immediate and telling. "I don't want to give my DNA," he said. "I watch those crime shows. I see how many people go to prison because they've given DNA." His refusal meant police had to get creative. They put Bass under surveillance, following him on his bakery delivery routes, hoping he would discard something that might contain his DNA. Night after night, they watched and waited. But Bass was careful. He threw nothing away that could be tested. The investigation might have stalled there. But Tim Bass had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated the people around him, particularly the women who worked alongside him every day. Kim Wagner was Bass's supervisor at the bakery, and she'd never quite felt comfortable around him. There was something off about the way he interacted with people, especially women. He never called her by name, instead referring to her simply as woman. The smallest things would set him off into angry outbursts, making co-workers wary of being around him. When investigators contacted the bakery and Kim realized they were investigating the Mandy Stavik murder, she put two and two together. They wanted DNA evidence from Tim Bass, and she was in a position to help them get it. For 3 months, Kim watched and waited, every day. She emptied the trash cans to make sure they were clean, hoping Tim would discard a cup or bottle that might contain his saliva. Every day, she watched him carefully, looking for her opportunity. Finally, it came. She saw him throw away a plastic cup, and later a Coke can. Her heart was racing as she retrieved the items, knowing that she might be handling evidence that could solve one of the most notorious crimes in the region's history. She hid the items in her desk drawer until she could turn them over to police. The wait for test results felt endless. But when Detective Kevin Bowie finally got the call from the state crime lab, the words he heard changed everything. "We've got a match." 28 years after Mandy Stavik's murder, police finally had their killer. The arrest of Timothy Bass on December 12, 2017, sent shockwaves through the community that had waited so long for answers. As Detective Bowie placed the handcuffs on the 50-year-old delivery driver in the bakery parking lot, the weight of nearly 3 decades seemed to lift from the shoulders of everyone who had never forgotten Mandy Stavik. But having a suspect and proving guilt in court are two very different things. Bass maintained his innocence, and his defense team was prepared to fight every piece of evidence the prosecution presented. When confronted with the DNA match, Bass's story began to evolve in ways that shocked even seasoned investigators. The man who had initially claimed he barely remembered Mandy suddenly had a very different tale to tell. He now insisted that he and Mandy had been having a secret affair, that their encounter had been consensual. It was a desperate gambit, one that required the jury to believe that an 18-year-old college freshman would have willingly engaged in a relationship with a man she'd never been seen with, never called, never mentioned to family or friends. The defense argued that DNA evidence only proved contact had occurred, not that a crime had been committed. But the prosecution had more than just DNA. They had a pattern of behavior that painted a disturbing picture of Timothy Bass. His own family members took the stand against him, describing a man who had shown disturbing attitudes toward women throughout his life. His ex-wife testified about years of controlling, abusive behavior. His brother revealed how Bass had asked him to lie to police, even suggesting they blame their deceased father for the crime. Perhaps most damning was the testimony from Kim Wagner, the brave woman who had helped police obtain the crucial DNA evidence. Her decision to act had been driven by a simple principle: doing what was right for Mandy. The trial lasted 9 days, but the jury's deliberation was mercifully brief. After just 5 hours, they returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts of first-degree murder, first-degree rape, and first-degree kidnapping. 29 years and 6 months after Mandy Stavik was found floating in the Nooksack River, justice had finally been served. At his sentencing, Bass continued to proclaim his innocence, but Judge Evan Chaffee was unmoved. He sentenced Bass to nearly 27 years in prison, ensuring that the man who had stolen so much from so many would spend the rest of his meaningful life behind bars. For Mandy's family, the verdict brought a mixture of relief and continued grief. Her mother, Mary, who had spent decades wondering if she would ever see justice for her daughter, finally had her answer. Her sister, Molly, who had carried the pain of loss for so long, could finally begin to heal. But perhaps the most profound impact was felt by the community of Acme itself. The arrest and conviction of Timothy Bass didn't just solve a murder case, it gave back something that had been stolen from them nearly 30 years earlier. The fear that had shadowed their daily lives, the suspicion that had tainted their interactions, the loss of innocence that had changed their community forever. None of that could be completely undone, but they could finally stop looking over their shoulders. They could finally trust that the monster who had walked among them was where he belonged. The case of Mandy Stavik became more than just a murder investigation. It became a testament to the power of persistence, the importance of community, and the courage of ordinary people to do extraordinary things. From Detective Bowie, who never gave up on a case that others had written off, to Kim Wagner, who risked her own safety to help catch a killer, to the 2 mothers at a water park who finally found the courage to speak up. It took a village to bring Timothy Bass to justice. Today, Acme remains a small, close-knit community nestled in the shadow of the mountains. Children still play outside until the streetlights come on. Neighbors still help neighbors. And while the scars of November 1989 will never completely fade, the people of this town have reclaimed something precious: the knowledge that evil may find its way into paradise, but it cannot stay hidden forever. Mandy Stavik was just 18 years old when her life was cut short, but her legacy lives on in the justice that was finally served and in the community that never forgot her name. In the end, love proved stronger than fear, truth more powerful than lies, and justice, though delayed, would not be denied. This was the case no one could forget, and now, finally, no one has to. May 5th, 2009. A date that would forever change a quiet suburban community and shatter the illusion of safety that so many families take for granted. What started as a routine morning would quickly transform into one of the most shocking and disturbing crime scenes that seasoned investigators had ever encountered. Picture this. You're living in what appears to be the perfect American neighborhood. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, children playing in front yards. The kind of place where people still wave to their neighbors and leave their doors unlocked. Where the biggest worry might be whether the kids remembered their homework or if dinner would be ready on time. But sometimes, evil hides behind the most ordinary facades. Sometimes, the person you trust most becomes the very person you should fear. And sometimes, the warning signs are literally written on the wall. This is the story of a family that seemed to have everything: a devoted mother, 2 young boys with bright futures ahead of them, and a father who worked in security, protecting others for a living. It's also the story of how quickly that perfect life can crumble when secrets, lies, and obsessions collide in the most devastating way possible. The morning began like countless others in Columbia, Illinois, a small community just outside St. Louis, where neighbors knew each other by name and children rode their bikes safely through quiet subdivisions. It was the kind of place where violent crime seemed impossible, where families moved to escape the dangers of city life. Christopher Coleman had left his house that morning around 5:40, heading to the gym as part of his regular routine. His wife Sherry and their two sons, 11-year-old Garrett and 9-year-old Gavin, were still sleeping peacefully in their beds. Or at least, that's what everyone believed at the time. By 7 in the morning, Chris was trying to reach his family by phone. When nobody answered, concern began to creep in. After all, Sherry should have been awake by then, getting the boys ready for school, going through the familiar morning rituals that define family life. What happened next would expose a web of deception so twisted and cruel that it would challenge everything this community thought they knew about the people living among them. Detective Justin Barlow lived just across the street from the Coleman family. For 5 years, he had been their neighbor, watching their children grow, exchanging pleasantries over backyard fences. When Chris called that morning, asking someone to check on his family, Barlow had no idea he was about to walk into a nightmare. The house looked normal from the outside. Nothing seemed out of place. The kind of suburban home you'd see in any middle-class neighborhood across America. But appearances, as we're about to discover, can be devastatingly deceiving. Barlow approached the front door first, peering through windows, looking for any sign of the family inside. When that revealed nothing, he made his way around to the basement area. That's when he noticed something that would prove to be crucial to understanding how this horror unfolded. A basement window was open, not just unlocked, but actually open, in a house where the family had been receiving death threats, where security should have been paramount. This detail would later raise serious questions about what really happened that night. The detective entered through the basement, making his way up the stairs toward the main floor of the house. The first thing that hit him wasn't what he saw, but what he smelled. The sharp, acrid scent of spray paint hung heavy in the air, creating an atmosphere of dread before he even understood why. As he reached the main floor and turned toward the kitchen area, Barlow encountered something that would haunt him for the rest of his career. Scrawled across the walls in red spray paint were messages that seemed torn from the darkest corners of human imagination. Words like "punished" stared back at him, written in what appeared to be the hand of someone consumed by rage and hatred. These weren't random acts of vandalism. These messages had a purpose, a meaning that would become clear as the investigation unfolded. They were meant to tell a story, to point investigators in a specific direction, to create a narrative that would explain the unspeakable acts that had taken place in this suburban home. But Detective Barlow's discovery was far from over. Following the trail of disturbing messages, he made his way upstairs to the bedrooms where the family should have been sleeping safely. What he found there would shake this small community to its core and launch one of the most intensive investigations in the region's history. The scene upstairs was one of calculated brutality, masked by an attempt to stage something else entirely. 3 lives had been taken during the night, each victim found in their own bedroom, each having met their end in the place where they should have felt most secure. Sherry Coleman, 31 years old, was discovered in the master bedroom. Her 2 young sons, Garrett and Gavin, were found in their respective rooms, their lives cut short before they had barely begun to live them. The method used to end their lives was particularly disturbing, suggesting an intimate knowledge of the victims and a level of planning that went far beyond a random act of violence. But perhaps most chilling of all were the additional messages left throughout the house. More spray-painted words that seemed designed to tell a specific story about who might have committed these acts and why. Messages that would initially lead investigators down one path, only to have the evidence eventually point in a completely different direction. The phrase, "You have paid," was found leading up the staircase, as if marking a trail toward the bedrooms where the victims lay. It was a message that suggested retribution, that these deaths were somehow justified in the mind of whoever wrote those words. As word spread through the neighborhood that morning, the peaceful suburban community of Columbia was transformed into something resembling a war zone. Police cars, ambulances, and crime scene investigators descended on what had been a quiet residential street. Neighbors emerged from their homes, many still in their pajamas, trying to understand what could have happened to the family they all knew and respected. The Coleman family had seemed to embody everything that made this community special. Chris worked in security for a prominent religious organization, providing protection for high-profile events and traveling around the world in service of his faith. Sherry was a devoted mother who had put her own career aside to focus on raising their two boys. Garrett and Gavin were the kind of children that made adults smile when they saw them playing in the front yard. Polite, well-mannered, always ready to help a neighbor or lend a hand with yard work, they were active in local sports, did well in school, and seemed to have unlimited potential ahead of them. This was not the kind of family that anyone would expect to become victims of such brutal violence. They were pillars of their community, respected by neighbors, and seemingly living the American dream in a place where dreams were supposed to come true safely. But as investigators would soon discover, beneath the surface of this perfect family portrait lay secrets that would shock everyone who thought they knew the Colemans. Secrets about relationships, about deception, and about a plan so methodical and cruel that it would challenge everything people believed about human nature. The death threats that had been arriving at the Coleman home for months suddenly took on new significance. Were these murders the result of Chris's work in security? Had someone targeted his family as a way to get to the prominent religious figure he protected? Or was there something else entirely at play here? As investigators began piecing together the timeline of that horrific morning, questions started mounting faster than answers. The major case squad was called in immediately, bringing together 25 of the most experienced detectives from across the region. This wasn't just another crime scene. This was something that would test every skill they had developed over years of investigating the darkest aspects of human behavior. The house itself became a puzzle that investigators would spend weeks trying to solve. Every room told part of a story, but the pieces didn't quite fit together the way they should have. The basement window that had been left open raised immediate red flags. Here was a family that had been living under the shadow of death threats for months, yet their home had been left vulnerable to exactly the kind of intrusion they should have been guarding against. Christopher Coleman was brought to the police station that morning, not as a suspect, but as a grieving husband and father who needed to help investigators understand what might have happened to his family. The image he presented was one of absolute devastation, a man whose world had just collapsed around him, who couldn't comprehend how such evil could have touched his loved ones. But experienced detectives know that grief can manifest in many different ways. Some people become hysterical, others withdraw completely. Some ask endless questions about what happened and how their loved ones died. Chris Coleman's reaction fell into none of these typical categories, and that began to concern the investigators who were trying to help him. During those first crucial hours of questioning, Coleman seemed oddly detached from the horror that had befallen his family. He never asked about the specific details of how his wife and children had died. He didn't demand to know what evidence had been found or what leads investigators were pursuing. For a man whose family had just been brutally murdered, his lack of curiosity struck the detectives as unusual. The investigation quickly expanded beyond the confines of Columbia, Illinois. If these murders were connected to Coleman's work in security, then the suspect pool could include anyone from around the world who might have harbored resentment against the religious organization he protected. Investigators began tracking down individuals who had sent threatening emails or made hostile comments about the ministry's work. It was painstaking detective work that involved following leads across multiple states and even international boundaries. Every person who had ever expressed anger or frustration had to be located and their whereabouts verified for the night of the murders. It was the kind of investigation that could take months or even years to complete thoroughly. But while that global search was underway, investigators were also looking more closely at the evidence found within the Coleman home itself. The spray-painted messages that had initially seemed to point toward an outsider with a grudge began revealing details that didn't quite match the narrative they appeared to tell. The handwriting analysis became a crucial component of the investigation. Experts were brought in to examine every letter, every stroke of the spray paint that had been used to create those menacing messages. What they discovered would eventually become one of the most damning pieces of evidence in the entire case. Meanwhile, the community of Columbia was struggling to come to terms with the reality that such violence could occur in their peaceful neighborhood. Parents began walking their children to school instead of letting them go alone. Neighbors started locking doors that had remained open for years. The sense of security that had drawn so many families to this area was shattered in a single morning. Local churches organized prayer vigils and support groups for families who were having trouble explaining to their children how something so terrible could happen to people they knew. The psychological impact rippled through the entire community, affecting not just those who knew the Colemans personally, but anyone who had ever felt safe in their own home. As the investigation progressed, detectives began uncovering aspects of Christopher Coleman's life that painted a very different picture than the one his neighbors and community members had known. Phone records, computer files, and financial documents started revealing a complex web of relationships and motivations that had nothing to do with religious extremists or international threats. The death threats that had been arriving at the Coleman home for months suddenly took on a different significance as investigators dug deeper into their origins. Computer forensics experts were brought in to trace the digital footprints of these threatening messages, and what they discovered would turn the entire investigation on its head. Every email, every letter, every threatening communication was subjected to the most advanced analysis available. The technology existed to trace these messages back to their source, to determine not just where they had come from, but what devices had been used to create them. The results of this analysis would prove to be absolutely devastating to the narrative that had initially seemed so obvious. As weeks turned into months, the investigation revealed layer after layer of deception that went far beyond anything investigators had initially imagined. This wasn't just a case of a family being targeted by strangers. This was something far more personal, far more calculated, and far more disturbing than anyone in Columbia could have anticipated. The perfect family that neighbors had admired was revealed to be struggling with issues that nobody outside their home had ever suspected. Financial pressures, relationship problems, and personal conflicts that had been carefully hidden behind a facade of suburban normalcy. The kind of problems that millions of families face, but that in this case had escalated to unthinkable consequences. Detective work of this magnitude requires not just technical expertise, but also the ability to understand human psychology and motivation. Investigators had to piece together not just what had happened on that terrible night, But why someone would be driven to commit such acts against people who should have been able to trust them completely? The evidence was mounting, but it was pointing in a direction that nobody had wanted to consider. Sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is someone you see every day, someone you trust implicitly, someone who knows your routines and your vulnerabilities better than any stranger ever could. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that Tara Lynch, a woman from Florida who had claimed to be merely a friend, was actually much more than that. Phone records revealed hundreds of calls and text messages between her and Christopher Coleman. Credit card statements showed trips they had taken together. Hotel reservations painted a picture of a relationship that had been going on for months, hidden from everyone in Colombia. What made this discovery even more shocking was the connection between Tara and the Coleman family. She wasn't just some random woman that Chris had met through work. She was actually one of Sherry's old friends from high school. The ultimate betrayal was unfolding before investigators' eyes. The timeline was becoming clearer with each piece of evidence they uncovered. The affair had begun in the fall of 2008, just months before the death threats started arriving at the Coleman home. The connection between these two events was too significant to ignore. Computer forensics revealed something that would prove absolutely crucial to the case. Those threatening emails that had initially pointed investigators toward international suspects had actually originated from Christopher Coleman's own laptop. The account that had been used to send them was created using information that only someone with intimate knowledge of the Coleman family would have known. The spray paint used to write those menacing messages on the walls had been purchased at a local hardware store, and the receipt bore Christopher Coleman's signature. The same man who had reported receiving death threats had actually been the one creating them all along. But perhaps the most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Tara Lynch had been keeping detailed records of her relationship with Coleman, including photos and videos that contradicted everything he had told investigators about the timeline of their affair. Among these photos was one that would ultimately seal Coleman's fate. A picture of the couple kissing, with a timestamp showing it had been taken weeks before Coleman claimed their relationship had even begun. When confronted with this evidence, his carefully constructed story began falling apart completely. The motive became crystal clear once investigators understood the full scope of Coleman's deception. He had been living a double life for months, promising Tara that he would divorce his wife and start a new life with her. They had even discussed wedding dates and future plans together, but there was a problem. Coleman's job with the religious ministry came with strict moral guidelines. Adultery could cost him his position and his substantial salary. He needed Sherry to be the one to file for divorce, to make it appear that the marriage had failed through no fault of his own. When Sherry discovered the affair but refused to divorce him, Coleman found himself trapped. He couldn't marry Tara without losing his job, but he couldn't continue the deception indefinitely either. The pressure was mounting from all sides, and he began planning what he believed would be the perfect solution. The death threats served multiple purposes in his scheme. They established a pattern of outside danger that would provide an obvious suspect when the murders occurred. They also gave him an excuse to install security cameras in his home, which he could later claim had malfunctioned or been tampered with. On the night of May 4th, Coleman put his plan into action. While his family slept, he methodically ended their lives, then spent time creating the crime scene that would support his story. The spray-painted messages, the open window, the missing security footage. Every detail had been calculated to point investigators away from him. The autopsy results revealed the true horror of what had happened that night. Sherry had fought for her life, sustaining injuries that indicated a violent struggle. Her 2 young sons had been killed in their beds, never having a chance to defend themselves or escape. Physical evidence on Coleman's body told the story of that final confrontation with his wife. Scratches on his arms matched the defensive wounds found on Sherry's hands. DNA evidence linked him directly to the crime scene, despite his attempts to clean up afterward. When Christopher Coleman was finally arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, the community's shock was palpable. This was a man they had trusted, respected, and admired. The revelation that he had been capable of such calculated evil shattered their faith in their own judgment about human nature. The trial that followed would captivate the nation and force everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about the capacity for deception that exists within seemingly ordinary people. The evidence presented painted a picture of a man so consumed by selfishness and obsession that he was willing to destroy everything and everyone who stood in the way of his desires. In the end, justice was served. Christopher Coleman was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But for the community of Columbia, for Sherry's family and friends, and for everyone who had known and loved Garrett and Gavin, no verdict could ever truly heal the wounds left behind. The writing had indeed been on the wall, but not in the way anyone had initially understood. The real message wasn't in those spray-painted threats or staged crime scene elements. It was in the pattern of lies, the web of deception, and the cold calculation that had led a father and husband to become the very monster his family should have been protected from. This case serves as a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it lives quietly among us, wearing familiar faces and maintaining respectable facades, waiting for the right moment to reveal its true nature. The most dangerous predators are often those who know us best, who understand our vulnerabilities, and who have earned our trust through years of careful deception. The community of Columbia eventually began to heal, but they never forgot the lessons learned from this tragedy. They created memorials to honor Sherry, Garrett, and Gavin, ensuring that their memory would live on long after the horror of their deaths had faded. And they remained vigilant, understanding now that safety isn't guaranteed simply by living in the right neighborhood or surrounding yourself with the right people. The writing on the wall had told a story, but it wasn't the story anyone expected to read. Sometimes the greatest danger comes from the person you think you know, a face you recognize, a voice you trust, someone who's been inside your home, someone you've hired, someone you've helped. It's September 8th, 2010, and for one Kansas woman, an ordinary morning is about to become a nightmare that will change her life forever. Marty Hill had no reason to be afraid that morning. At just 97 pounds, she was a powerhouse at work, known for her reliability and dedication. Her co-workers called her dynamite in a small package. She was the type of person who always showed up, always got things done, always made everything around her better. Which is exactly why, when she didn't show up for the 10 o'clock production meeting at her apparel company, everyone knew something was terribly wrong. The tight-knit group at her workplace had never seen Marty miss a meeting without explanation. She was dependable to a fault. When text messages went unanswered and phone calls went straight to voicemail, concern quickly turned to fear. By 11:30 that morning, a co-worker made the decision to drive to Marty's house. What they found there would launch an investigation that would reveal just how dangerous it can be to trust the wrong person. Marty's car sat in the driveway. Her front door was closed but unlocked. Her purse sat undisturbed on the kitchen table. But Marty was nowhere to be found upstairs. It wasn't until police arrived and ventured into the basement that they discovered the horrifying truth. At the bottom of those basement stairs lay a woman covered head to toe in blood, breathing but barely alive. The amount of blood surrounding her on the floor told a story of unimaginable violence. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a random break-in. This was something far more personal and infinitely more terrifying. The officer who found her knelt beside the barely conscious woman and asked the question that would drive the entire investigation. Who did this to you? Who did this in those critical moments? As Marty fought for her life, the race was on to find her attacker before they could strike again. When paramedics rushed Marty to the hospital, doctors were stunned by the extent of her injuries. The major veins, skin, and muscle of her left neck had been completely severed. The major artery had multiple scrapes on it, missing complete severance by mere millimeters. Her face was swollen beyond recognition, covered in bruises that spoke to a sustained and vicious beating. The head trauma alone was life-threatening. For the next hour and a half, surgeons worked meticulously to piece together the damage, cleaning and repairing injuries that should have killed her. Even then, doctors remained gravely concerned about brain swelling and the possibility that Marty might not survive the next 24 to 72 hours. Her family arrived at the hospital to find a woman they barely recognized. Marty's eyes were swollen completely shut. Her head was 3 times its normal size. Her teenage daughter later described seeing only her mother's hands and knowing those were the only parts she could still identify. The emotional trauma of seeing their loved one in this condition was almost unbearable. But even as Marty fought for her life in the ICU, investigators were working around the clock to find her attacker. With no signs of sexual assault and no theft from the home, the motive remained a complete mystery. Marty's mother provided crucial information about her daughter's quiet lifestyle. She was a workaholic who rarely left the house except for work. She wasn't dating anyone and kept to herself. The investigation initially focused on Marty's ex-husband, Steve Hill. In cases like this, law enforcement always looks first at those closest to the victim. But Steve was cooperative, providing a detailed account of his activities that day and expressing genuine concern for Marty's well-being. He wanted to find her attacker just as desperately as everyone else did. With Steve cleared as a suspect, investigators found themselves with very limited leads. That's when Marty's mother mentioned B&J Construction, a company that had recently done work on both her home and Marty's. The supervisor, a man named Brian, had seemed like a nice guy, a hard worker, and a family man. Marty's mother had even recommended him based on the quality work he'd done at her house. Brian Pennington was 26 years old and lived in Leeton, Missouri, about an hour and a half from Kansas City. When detectives arrived at his secluded dark house around 9 p.m., they found him polite and cooperative. But something wasn't right. Brian had several fresh scratches on the left side of his face that he claimed came from his dog jumping on him the day before. To the trained eyes of experienced investigators, those scratches didn't look consistent with what a dog would do. Brian kept emphasizing his financial difficulties, claiming there was no way he could have driven to Kansas City because he didn't have money for gas. His young wife, Jessica, backed up his alibi, insisting he'd been home with her the entire time. But when detectives asked to search Brian's clothing for any bloodstains, he readily agreed. What they found in a hamper in the corner of the bathroom would change everything. A pair of jeans near the bottom was covered in red stains, concentrated around the knees and lower portions of the legs. Brian claimed the stains weren't blood, but when detectives rushed the jeans to the crime lab that same night, they tested positive for human blood within 30 minutes. The question now was whose blood it was, and investigators would have to wait several more days for DNA results. The cooperation Brian showed in allowing the search of his home surprised investigators. Most guilty parties don't willingly hand over evidence that could convict them. But perhaps Brian thought the investigation wouldn't go any further. that his word and his wife's alibi would be enough to clear him. Meanwhile, Marty remained in critical condition, unable to communicate with investigators. Doctors were cautiously optimistic, but her recovery was far from certain. The attack had been so brutal, so sustained, that it seemed impossible anyone could survive it. Yet somehow, Marty was fighting back. On the third day after the attack, everything changed. Marty suddenly began to speak, and with her words came the flood of memories from that terrible morning. There was no confusion, no uncertainty in her voice. She knew exactly who had attacked her and why she had opened her door to him that early morning. The man she named would shock everyone who knew him as a trusted contractor, a family man, someone who had been welcomed into homes throughout the community. But appearances, as this case would prove, can be fatally deceiving. As the DNA results came back, confirming that the blood on Brian Pennington's jeans belonged to Marty Hill, investigators realized they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than they had initially imagined. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. This was something much darker, and the question that haunted everyone involved was simple: why? Brian Pennington had been in Marty's home before. He'd done work there, earned her trust, been paid for his services. When he knocked on her door that September morning, she had no reason to fear him. She recognized his face, knew his voice, remembered the quality of his work. It was this familiarity that made him so dangerous. According to Marty's recollection, Brian mentioned something about the basement, something he thought she should know about from his previous work there. It seemed reasonable enough. Contractors often remembered details about jobs, noticed things that needed attention. So when he suggested they go downstairs to look at something, Marty led the way. She was 2 steps from the bottom when everything changed. Without warning, without explanation, Brian grabbed her throat with a grip so tight and strong that her voice began to fade. She kept asking what he was doing, but he remained silent. The man who had made pleasant conversation during his work visits now showed no emotion, offered no explanation for the violence he was inflicting. As her voice grew weaker and softer, Marty realized she couldn't speak at all. Then darkness took over, and she lost consciousness. What happened next would be reconstructed by forensic evidence and medical testimony, painting a picture of violence so extreme it defied comprehension. The investigation revealed that after strangling Marty into unconsciousness, Brian didn't stop there. Evidence suggested he then beat her head repeatedly against the concrete basement floor, causing multiple facial fractures and severe brain trauma. The sustained nature of the attack spoke to a level of rage that seemed completely disconnected from any rational motive. But even that wasn't enough. In what prosecutors would later describe as an act of pure evil, Brian then took out a knife and slashed Marty's throat 3 to 4 times, leaving her to die alone in her basement. The cuts were so deep they severed major blood vessels and came within millimeters of completely cutting through her main artery. The crime scene told a story of unimaginable brutality. Blood covered the basement floor from corner to corner. The violence had been so extensive, so sustained, that investigators who had worked hundreds of cases said they'd never seen anything quite like it. This wasn't the work of someone who had lost control in a moment of anger. This was methodical, deliberate, and designed to ensure the victim would not survive. But Brian Pennington had made one critical miscalculation. He believed Marty was dead when he left her basement that morning. He had no way of knowing that this small, seemingly fragile woman possessed a strength that would defy every medical expectation. When investigators arrived at his door that evening, Brian appeared genuinely surprised to learn that Marty was still alive. His cooperation during the initial interview now made perfect sense. If he believed his victim was dead, then there would be no witness to identify him. The scratches on his face could be explained away. The blood on his jeans could be dismissed as something else entirely. He likely thought the investigation would focus elsewhere, perhaps on a stranger or someone with an obvious motive. The DNA evidence changed everything. When the lab confirmed that the blood on Brian's jeans belonged to Marty Hill, investigators knew they had their man, but they still needed to understand the scope of who they were dealing with. Further investigation into Brian's background revealed a pattern of violence that painted a chilling picture of escalation. Records showed Brian had over 60 contacts with law enforcement officers throughout his young life. He had been involved in multiple domestic violence incidents that resulted in injuries to victims. 2 wives, 2 girlfriends, all had experienced his capacity for brutality. For Brian Pennington, beating women wasn't something new or unprecedented. It was a pattern of behavior that had been building towards something catastrophic. The revelation about Brian's history of domestic violence cast his wife Jessica's initial alibi in a different light. When detectives first interviewed her, she had seemed nervous, young, naive. She insisted her husband had been home with her during the entire time frame of the attack. But investigators suspected she was lying to protect him, possibly out of fear of what he might do to her if she told the truth. Jessica was only 20 years old with 2 young children. She had experienced Brian's violence firsthand and knew what he was capable of when crossed. Her initial lie wasn't born of loyalty, but of terror. She understood that cooperating with police could put her own life in danger. When investigators approached Jessica separately, away from her husband's presence, they were able to get her to open up about the truth. They explained to her how severely beaten Marty had been, how close she had come to dying, and how important it was for justice to be served. The human side of Jessica responded to this appeal. In a breakthrough moment for the case, Jessica broke down and admitted she had lied. Brian had not been home with her during the time of the attack. In fact, she revealed that her husband had a history of assaulting and threatening her as well. Her false alibi had been given out of fear, but learning about the extent of Marty's injuries helped her find the courage to tell the truth. Jessica's admission transformed her from a hostile witness protecting her abuser into one of the prosecution's most important allies. Her testimony would prove crucial in establishing that Brian had no alibi for the morning of the attack, and that his pattern of violence against women extended far beyond what happened to Marty. As the case against Brian Pennington solidified, investigators felt confident they could secure a conviction. The DNA evidence was ironclad. Marty's identification was clear and unwavering. Jessica's recanted testimony eliminated Brian's alibi. The scratches on his face corroborated a physical struggle. Everything pointed to one inescapable conclusion, but the question that haunted everyone involved in the case remained unanswered. Why had Brian Pennington decided to brutally attack a woman who had hired him, paid him fairly, and treated him with respect? There had been no theft from Marty's home. Money and valuables were left untouched. There was no evidence of sexual assault, no history of conflict or disagreement between them. The randomness of the violence was perhaps its most terrifying aspect. If Brian could attack Marty without any apparent motive, then no one who had ever hired him or interacted with him was truly safe. The realization sent shockwaves through the community and raised uncomfortable questions about how well we really know the people we invite into our homes and lives. For Marty's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and continued anguish. Relief that the monster who had nearly killed their loved one was behind bars. Anguish over the senseless nature of the crime and the long road to recovery that still lay ahead. The physical healing was only the beginning. The emotional and psychological trauma would take much longer to address, Marty herself faced the daunting prospect of rebuilding her life from the ground up. The brain injury had affected her balance, her vision, her hearing, her memory, and her ability to process information normally. Simple tasks that had once been automatic now required conscious effort and concentration. The strong, capable woman who had been known for her reliability and competence now struggled with basic functions, yet even as she fought to regain her physical abilities, Marty demonstrated the same determination that had kept her alive through the attack. With the support of her family and medical team, she began the slow process of recovery, knowing that her survival and her willingness to testify would be crucial to ensuring Brian Pennington faced justice for his crimes. The legal proceedings that followed would test everyone involved in ways they never imagined. Brian Pennington was charged with attempted first-degree murder, and the prosecution was determined to see him serve the maximum sentence allowed under law. The evidence seemed overwhelming, but in the American justice system, even the most clear-cut cases can take unexpected turns. As preparations for trial began, the prosecution team faced a critical decision about how to present their case. The DNA evidence on Pennington's genes was powerful, but they knew defense attorneys would try to create reasonable doubt wherever possible. The lack of a clear motive remained problematic, giving the defense room to argue that perhaps someone else had committed the crime. Marty's recovery continued slowly but steadily. The woman who had once been known for her sharp mind and quick wit now struggled with basic cognitive functions. Her speech was sometimes unclear, her memory had gaps, and her physical coordination remained impaired. The prosecution worried whether she would be strong enough to testify and whether a jury would find her testimony credible given her brain injury. But Marty possessed something that no amount of physical trauma could destroy: an unshakable determination to see justice done. She worked tirelessly with speech therapists and physical rehabilitation specialists, driven by the knowledge that her testimony could be the key to putting her attacker behind bars. Her children watched in amazement as their mother fought to reclaim pieces of herself that had been stolen in those terrible minutes in her basement. The preliminary hearing arrived with tremendous anticipation and anxiety. This would be the first time Marty would face her attacker in a courtroom setting, and no one knew how she would react. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If the prosecution failed to convince the judge there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial, Pennington would walk free. When Pennington was brought into the courtroom, the contrast was stark. He sat alone on his side of the room, with no family members present to support him. Not even his mother had come. He stared straight ahead, showing no emotion, until Marty entered the courtroom. Only then did his head turn, his eyes following her slow, deliberate walk to the witness stand. Those who witnessed that moment described it as chilling. Pennington's expression seemed to convey disbelief that his victim was not only alive, but walking into court to testify against him. The ghost he thought he had created was very much real and very much determined to see him pay for what he had done. Marty's testimony was powerful in its simplicity. Despite her injuries and the trauma she had endured, her identification of Pennington was clear and unwavering. She looked directly at him as she spoke, showing a courage that inspired everyone in the courtroom. Her voice may have been weaker than before, but her words carried the weight of absolute truth. The prosecution's case was further strengthened when Jessica Pennington took the stand. Her decision to tell the truth about her husband's whereabouts that morning was crucial, but it came at great personal cost. She knew that by testifying against him, she was putting herself and her children at risk of retaliation. Yet she found the strength to do what was right. The judge ruled that there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. But as the case moved forward, unexpected developments began to emerge. Pennington's defense team, recognizing the strength of the evidence against their client, began exploring the possibility of a plea agreement. The prospect of facing a jury with DNA evidence, victim identification, and witness testimony seemed daunting even to experienced defense attorneys. Negotiations between the prosecution and defense stretched on for months. The central question was how much time Pennington would serve in prison. The prosecution wanted to ensure he would be locked away for as long as legally possible, while the defense sought to minimize his sentence. For Marty and her family, the uncertainty was agonizing. Eventually, both sides reached an agreement. Pennington would plead guilty to the charges against him in exchange for a sentence of 28.5 years in prison. For the prosecution, it guaranteed a significant prison term without the uncertainty of a jury trial. For Marty, it meant she wouldn't have to endure the grueling process of a full trial and could begin to find some closure. But even this resolution would not come without drama. On the day of sentencing, as family members prepared to deliver victim impact statements, Pennington shocked everyone by attempting to withdraw his guilty plea. After weeks of accepting responsibility for his actions, he suddenly claimed the pressure was too much and the sentence too long. The judge was having none of it. Pennington's reasons for wanting to withdraw his plea were deemed insufficient, and the sentencing proceeded as planned. One by one, Marty's family members stood before the court to tell Pennington exactly how his actions had affected their lives. Her teenage daughter's statement was particularly powerful. She looked directly at Pennington as she spoke about the trauma of seeing her mother in the hospital, about the fear that had consumed their family, about the strength they had found in each other. Even though Pennington refused to look at her, she knew he was hearing every word. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Marty herself stood before the man who had tried to kill her. Her voice was steady as she spoke about his betrayal of her trust, about the pain he had caused not just to her, but to everyone who loved her. She asked him the question that had haunted her since that terrible morning. "Why did you do this to me?" Pennington's response was silence. Even given the opportunity to explain his actions, to show some remorse, to offer some understanding of what had driven him to such violence, he chose to say nothing. That silence spoke volumes about the kind of person he truly was. The judge sentenced Brian Pennington to 28.5 years in the Kansas state prison system. He would have to serve at least a significant portion of that sentence before becoming eligible for parole. For a man who had lived only 26 years, the prospect of spending more time behind bars than he had spent as a free man was sobering. Today, Marty Hill continues her recovery, forever changed, but never broken by what happened to her. The scars on her neck serve as a constant reminder of how close she came to death, but they also represent her incredible survival. She has returned to kickboxing, pushing herself physically as part of her ongoing rehabilitation. The woman who once weighed 97 pounds and was known as dynamite in a small package has proven that some forces of nature cannot be extinguished. Her story serves as a chilling reminder that evil can wear a familiar face, that danger can come from the most unexpected sources. Brian Pennington wasn't a stranger lurking in shadows. He was someone Marty knew, someone she had trusted, someone she had welcomed into her home. That betrayal of trust makes his crime even more heinous, and her survival even more remarkable. The question of motive may never be fully answered. Pennington's silence has left his victim and her family without the closure that understanding might bring. But perhaps that's fitting. Some acts of violence are so senseless, so devoid of rational explanation, that trying to understand them is futile. What matters is that justice was served, that a dangerous predator was removed from society, and that a remarkable woman found the strength to survive and rebuild her life. In the end, this case reminds us all to be vigilant, to trust our instincts, and to remember that sometimes the greatest threats come from those we least suspect. The stranger you know may be the most dangerous stranger of all. The small town of Corning, New York, seemed like the perfect place to raise a family. Tree-lined streets, neighbors who knew each other's names, and the kind of community where people still left their doors unlocked at night. For Michelle Neureuther, this quiet upstate haven represented everything she wanted for her 3 daughters after years of a troubled marriage. But on a late August afternoon in 2017, that sense of safety would be shattered forever. What appeared to be a tragic suicide would soon unravel into something far more sinister. A story involving manipulation, betrayal, and an unthinkable choice that would destroy a family from within. This is the story of how a father's obsession with control led to murder, and how he convinced his own daughter to help him commit the ultimate betrayal. Michelle Neureuther had always been the kind of mother who put her children first. After her divorce from Lloyd in 2013, she'd worked hard to create a stable home for her 3 girls. The oldest had already moved out. 19-year-old Carrie was away at college in Rochester, and the youngest, just 14, was still at home navigating the complexities of high school. Those who knew Michelle described her as brilliant and determined. She held a master's degree and taught English at a local college, always encouraging her daughters to be well-spoken and educated. After years of what friends described as an controlling marriage, Michelle seemed to be finding her footing as a single mother. The divorce hadn't been easy. Lloyd, an engineer at the local Corning Glass Works, had fought tooth and nail for custody of the children. What followed was a relentless legal battle that consumed years of Michelle's life and drained her emotionally and financially. Court records would later reveal an astounding 26 separate legal filings after their divorce was finalized. 26. In most cases, divorce attorneys see maybe 2 or 3 post-divorce filings at most. But Lloyd was different. He seemed determined to use the legal system as a weapon, filing motion after motion, making false claims, and trying to get out of child support payments. Michelle's friends and family watched as this legal harassment took its toll. Every time she thought she could move forward, another court date would appear, another filing, another attempt by Lloyd to drag her back into the system that had already caused her so much pain. But then, in late August 2017, something unexpected happened. Lloyd failed to show up for a crucial court hearing regarding his petition for sole custody of their youngest daughter. For a man who had been obsessively litigious for years, this was completely out of character. He didn't withdraw his petition, didn't ask for a postponement, didn't even answer the court's calls or emails. Michelle's attorney was shocked. This was the same man who had filed motion after motion for years, and now he simply didn't show up. It was unthinkable, especially given his pattern of behavior. When the case was dismissed due to his no-show, Michelle felt something she hadn't experienced in years: relief. For the first time since their bitter divorce, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, Lloyd was finally ready to move on. That weekend, Michelle seemed happier than she had been in months. Friends would later remember seeing her and her youngest daughter sliding down grassy hills on blocks of ice, laughing and enjoying the simple pleasure of a summer day together. It was the kind of carefree moment that had been rare during the years of legal battles, but that joy would be short-lived. On Monday, August 28th, a family friend arrived at Michelle's house to pick up her 14-year-old daughter for swim practice. When no one answered the door, concern quickly turned to alarm. Through the glass panels of the front door, the friend could see something was terribly wrong. Sergeant John McDivitt was the first police officer to respond to the scene that afternoon. What he found would haunt him for years to come. Michelle Neurouter was lying at the bottom of her staircase, a rope around her neck. She was cold and stiff to the touch, clearly having been dead for hours. At first glance, it appeared to be a suicide by hanging. But as McDivitt and other investigators examined the scene more closely, things didn't add up. There was an unusual ligature mark on Michelle's chin that didn't match the pattern they would expect to see in a typical hanging. It looked as though someone had gone behind her, thrown a rope over her neck, and pulled back and down. Even more concerning was the fact that Michelle's youngest daughter, the one who was supposed to be picked up for swim practice, was nowhere to be found. In a case that already seemed suspicious, a missing child raised the stakes dramatically. Police Chief Jeff Spaulding arrived on scene and immediately shared McDivitt's concerns. The physical evidence didn't match what they would expect to see in a suicide. The positioning of the body, the ligature marks, the rope itself. All of it seemed wrong somehow. As officers searched the house from top to bottom, checking basements, attics, and garages, the hours ticked by with no sign of the missing teenager. The possible outcomes were all terrifying to contemplate. Then, late that evening, the phone rang at the police station. It was Carrie, Michelle's 19-year-old daughter, calling from Rochester, nearly 100 miles away. She had devastating news to share, but also brought relief to the frantic search efforts. The 14-year-old was safe. She was with Carrie in Rochester, nearly 100 miles from the crime scene. But Carrie's explanation of how they ended up there would be the first of many stories that didn't quite make sense. She claimed that she had driven back to Corning late Saturday night to spend one last night in her childhood bedroom before the school semester began. According to Carrie, Michelle had become enraged at her, accusing her of taking Lloyd's side in their ongoing custody battle. Carrie told police that Michelle had been screaming and carrying on, and that she became concerned for her younger sister's safety. So, she claimed, she had taken the 14-year-old outside, put her in the car, and driven back to Rochester in the middle of the night. The story seemed plausible on the surface, but it raised immediate questions for investigators. Why would Michelle be so upset on the same day she had been celebrating a major legal victory? Friends and family who knew Michelle described her as determined and resilient, not someone who would take her own life just as things were finally looking up. Her mother, Jeanne, was adamant from the moment she heard the news. Michelle would never have committed suicide. She had fought too hard for too long to give up now. She had 3 daughters who needed her, a career she loved, and finally seemed to be emerging from the shadow of her toxic marriage. But if Michelle had been murdered, who could have done it? And how? Lloyd had what appeared to be an airtight alibi. According to both him and Carrie, he had been in California for a job interview when Michelle's body was discovered. He had flown out there on Sunday morning, more than 24 hours before police found Michelle on Monday afternoon. The timeline seemed to check out, but investigators weren't ready to rule anyone out just yet. They began digging deeper into the movements of everyone involved in the days leading up to Michelle's death. What they would discover would challenge everything they thought they knew about family loyalty, manipulation, and just how far a parent might go to control their children's lives. The investigation was just beginning, but already, nothing was as it seemed. When Lloyd finally returned from California and learned of Michelle's death, his first stop wasn't to comfort his grieving daughters or make funeral arrangements. Instead, he went straight to the family court building to stop his child support and maintenance payments. For investigators, This cold calculation was their first real glimpse into Lloyd's true character. But Lloyd seemed prepared for their questions. When police caught up with him outside the courthouse, he appeared calm and composed, ready with answers that matched Carrie's story perfectly. He explained how he had helped Carrie move into her college apartment on Saturday, stayed at a nearby hotel that night, and flew out to California early Sunday morning for his job interview. The hotel security cameras seemed to back up his story. There was Lloyd, checking into the microtel on Saturday evening. There was Carrie, arriving for breakfast with her younger sister the next morning at 7 a.m. The timestamps appeared to give Lloyd an ironclad alibi, but as investigators dug deeper into the surveillance footage, cracks began to appear in what had seemed like a perfect story. The cameras showed Lloyd walking Carrie to her car that Saturday night. But then something interesting happened. Instead of returning to the hotel alone, the video showed Lloyd getting into the car with Carrie and driving off into the night. More importantly, the cameras never showed him returning to the hotel that evening. While Lloyd's cell phone had remained in his hotel room all night, pinging the local towers consistently, Lloyd himself appeared to have been somewhere else entirely. The next morning, at 6:30 a.m., the cameras captured him walking across the parking lot toward his vehicle, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. For investigators, this was the first concrete evidence that Lloyd had been lying to them. But lying about where you spent the night doesn't necessarily make you a murderer. They needed more. The motive became clearer as they examined Lloyd's financial situation. Despite his engineering job at Corning, he was drowning in debt. Over $100,000 in credit card bills, and monthly payments to Michelle of nearly $6,000 in child support and alimony. The financial pressure was mounting, and Michelle's death would solve multiple problems at once. Not only would the support payments stop, but Lloyd stood to collect on Michelle's life insurance policy, worth $260,000. For a man facing financial ruin, his ex-wife's death represented a potential windfall 2.5 months after Michelle's death, with the case still officially undetermined. Investigators decided to employ a technique known in law enforcement circles as tickling the wire. They would place wiretaps on both Lloyd and Carrie's phones, then create a situation that might prompt them to have revealing conversations. The ruse was simple. An investigator called Carrie, claiming they had additional questions and wanted to meet with her again. It was a common technique, designed to create anxiety and hopefully prompt incriminating phone calls. The strategy worked better than they could have hoped. Within minutes of hanging up with police, Carrie was on the phone with her father, clearly panicked about the request for another meeting. Lloyd's response was telling. Instead of encouraging his daughter to cooperate with the investigation, he immediately began coaching her on what to say. More suspiciously, when Carrie suggested she could easily meet with the investigator and tell the same story she had already given, Lloyd shut down the idea entirely. He instructed her to claim he had a counseling appointment back in New Jersey and couldn't make himself available. For investigators listening in, Lloyd's behavior raised an obvious question. If they were both telling the truth about Michelle's death, why would Lloyd be so reluctant to speak with police again? Why coach Carrie on how to avoid the meeting? Innocent people typically want to help solve cases, not avoid investigators. But the wiretaps alone weren't enough to build a murder case. The district attorney needed more concrete evidence, so he took an unusual step. He asked a private forensic pathologist to take a fresh look at all the evidence from Michelle's autopsy. By this time, Lloyd had already had Michelle's body cremated, so there was no physical remains for the pathologist to examine. But using the original autopsy photos, documentation, and evidence from the scene, the expert reached a conclusion that changed everything. Michelle Neureuther had been murdered. The ligature mark on her chin, the specific pattern of hemorrhaging in her eyes, and other forensic details all pointed to one conclusion. Michelle had been strangled to death, and her body had been positioned to make it look like suicide. Armed with this new determination, investigators were ready to move. On January 24, 2018, nearly 5 months after Michelle's death, they coordinated simultaneous confrontations with both Lloyd and Carrie. 2 investigators showed up at Lloyd's office in New Jersey, while a pair of state police troopers found Carrie at her college internship in Syracuse. This was their Hail Mary pass, their chance to finally get the truth about what happened that night. The strategy of separating them proved crucial. When investigators told Lloyd that the medical examiner had ruled Michelle's death a homicide, he maintained his innocence. He even agreed to take a polygraph test, seeming confident in his ability to pass. But 200 miles away in Syracuse, Carrie was having a very different reaction to the news. Away from her father's influence for the first time since the murder, the psychological pressure finally became too much to bear. In barely a whisper, 19-year-old Carrie began to tell investigators what really happened on the night her mother died. Her father had come to Michelle's house with her that night, and she had helped him get inside undetected. According to Carrie's confession, Lloyd had approached her with an unthinkable proposition just 1 week before the murder. He claimed he was facing financial ruin and couldn't afford to keep paying Michelle. He presented his daughter with what he framed as an impossible choice. He could kill himself, leaving Carrie and her sisters orphaned and without financial support. Or there was what he called Plan B. He would kill Michelle instead, making it look like suicide, and the family's problems would be solved. For a 19-year-old who had been subjected to years of her father's manipulation and control, the choice seemed real. In her mind, she wasn't choosing between her parents' lives. She was choosing between losing one parent or losing both. The confession revealed the horrific details of that night. Carrie had driven back to Corning, not to spend a night in her childhood bedroom as she had originally claimed, but to help her father commit murder. She had brought him into the house through the front door, while her younger sister slept in the living room. Lloyd went upstairs to confront Michelle in her bedroom. At first, there was arguing. Michelle was confused and frightened, demanding to know why her ex-husband was in her home in the middle of the night. Then, according to Carrie, it suddenly got very quiet. When Carrie saw her father again, her mother was dead. But the confession revealed something even more disturbing. Carrie hadn't just helped Lloyd get into the house. She had helped him stage the suicide scene, moving Michelle's body and positioning the rope to make it look like she had taken her own life. The psychological manipulation that had led to this moment had been years in the making. What experts would later identify as parental alienation had systematically turned Carrie against her mother, making Michelle seem like the enemy rather than the victim. As investigators prepared to arrest Lloyd, they discovered he had vanished. The confident man who had agreed to take a polygraph test had disappeared rather than face the consequences of his actions. They tracked his cell phone to downtown Princeton, New Jersey, where they found him on the roof of a municipal parking garage. When officers moved in to arrest him, Lloyd bolted to the edge of the 5-story structure and threatened to jump. For 2 hours, he kept police at bay, teetering on the edge of the building as negotiators tried to talk him down. In the end, it took a tackle from a New Jersey state trooper to bring him safely into custody. The man who had orchestrated his ex-wife's murder and manipulated his own daughter into helping him was finally under arrest. But the most difficult questions were still ahead. How had a father convinced his child to help him kill her mother? And what price should Carrie pay for her role in such an unthinkable crime. The confession that Carrie gave to investigators that day would haunt everyone who heard it. Here was a 19-year-old college student describing in clinical detail how she had helped her father murder her mother. The psychological manipulation that had led to this moment was staggering in its scope and devastation. District Attorney Brooks Baker knew he was dealing with something unprecedented. In 30 years of prosecuting cases, he had never encountered anything quite like this. The level of control that Lloyd had exercised over his daughter, the systematic way he had turned her against her mother, represented what experts call parental alienation taken to its most extreme conclusion. Carrie's cooperation with the investigation became crucial to building the case against Lloyd. But her confession also revealed the depth of her own involvement. She hadn't just opened a door for her father. She had actively participated in staging Michelle's death to look like suicide, moving her mother's body and helping position the rope. The forensic evidence began to make sense once investigators understood what had really happened. Lloyd's DNA was found on Michelle's clothing, the pajamas she was wearing the night she was murdered. The unusual ligature mark on her chin now had an explanation. The positioning of her body at the bottom of the stairs suddenly fit the narrative of a staged crime scene. When Lloyd was finally captured after his dramatic standoff on the parking garage, prosecutors offered him a plea deal. He could admit his guilt and face 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole. Or he could go to trial and risk life without parole if convicted. Lloyd chose to plead guilty, but even in his confession, he couldn't resist blaming Michelle one final time. He told the judge he killed his ex-wife because he believed she might hurt their children. It was a final act of manipulation, an attempt to portray himself as a protective father rather than a calculating murderer. The judge saw through it immediately. Lloyd Neureuther was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At age 45, he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, never again able to manipulate or control anyone. But what about Carrie? The young woman who had been so thoroughly manipulated that she helped kill her own mother. Her case presented an almost impossible moral and legal question. How do you punish someone who was both perpetrator and victim? Michelle's mother, Jeanne, struggled with this question more than anyone. She had lost her daughter, but she also understood that Carrie had been psychologically destroyed by years of manipulation. In a letter to the court, she wrote that she didn't believe Michelle would want her daughter to spend decades in prison. The judge agreed. Carrie was allowed to plead guilty to second-degree manslaughter rather than murder. She was sentenced to 1 to 3 years in state prison, a remarkably lenient sentence that reflected the court's recognition of the extraordinary circumstances. Carrie was released on parole on January 16, 2020, after serving just over a year behind bars. She disappeared from public view, presumably trying to rebuild a life shattered by her father's manipulation and her own terrible choices. The case left everyone involved grappling with profound questions about family, manipulation, and justice. How does a parent convince their child to commit such an unthinkable act? How do you assign blame when the lines between victim and perpetrator become so blurred? Michelle Neureuther's death represents more than just another domestic violence case. It's a cautionary tale about the devastating power of psychological manipulation and the lengths to which some people will go to maintain control over others. Today, Lloyd remains in prison. His dreams of financial freedom and continued control over his family's lives reduced to the confines of a cell. His daughters must live with the knowledge that their father murdered their mother and convinced one of them to help. In the end, Michelle's fight for her children's well-being continued even after her death, as the truth of what happened that night finally came to light. The woman who had spent years trying to protect her daughters from their father's manipulation had become his final victim. But her story would serve as a warning about the deadly consequences of unchecked control and abuse. The small town of Corning, New York, where neighbors once felt safe leaving their doors unlocked, learned that the greatest dangers sometimes come from within our own families. And somewhere, a young woman tries to live with the choices she made on one terrible night, when a father's manipulation led to a mother's death and a family's destruction. Looking at this tragic case that shook a college community to its core, we need to examine how a promising young nursing student's life was cut short by someone she thought she could trust. Tonight, we're diving deep into the murder of Haley Anderson, a case that would span 2 countries and raise questions about justice, obsession, and the warning signs we sometimes choose to ignore. It was March 2018 when 22-year-old Haley Anderson disappeared from her off-campus apartment near Binghamton University. What started as concern among friends quickly escalated into a nightmare that would expose the dark side of a relationship gone terribly wrong. Haley Anderson embodied everything you'd expect from a dedicated nursing student approaching graduation. Her friends described her as a free spirit with an infectious energy that drew people to her. She was the type of person who trusted everyone she met, always seeing the good in people even when others warned her to be more cautious. This trusting nature would ultimately become both her greatest strength and her fatal weakness. Born and raised in Westbury, New York, Haley had worked tirelessly throughout her college years to achieve her dream of becoming a nurse. By March 2018, graduation was just around the corner, and she had already secured a nursing position back home. Her mother, Karen, was planning a celebration party, excited to have her daughter close again after years of college life upstate. But Haley's plans extended far beyond that first job. She dreamed of traveling to California, buying a hippie van, and working as a traveling nurse while exploring the country. It was a plan that perfectly captured her adventurous spirit and desire for freedom. At Binghamton University, Haley had cultivated a close group of friends who became like family to her. She lived in an off-campus apartment with roommates who knew her daily routines, her habits, and most importantly, when something was wrong. Among her social circle was Kevin Ocampo, her on-and-off boyfriend who genuinely loved her but understood that Haley wasn't ready for a serious commitment. She had made it clear that she wanted to experience freedom after graduation before settling down with anyone. It was through Kevin that Haley first encountered Orlando Tercero, a fellow nursing student who would eventually become the center of this tragic story. Orlando was born in Miami but raised in Nicaragua, coming from a well-to-do family with medical connections. His father was a physician, which likely influenced Orlando's decision to pursue nursing. By all accounts, he was a good student who worked hard during the week and enjoyed socializing on weekends. The initial meeting between Haley and Orlando happened in their nursing classes, but they didn't really connect until a party at Kevin's apartment during Haley's 4th year. Orlando and Kevin bonded over their shared Hispanic background and ability to speak Spanish, leading Kevin to invite Orlando to join his fraternity. What began as a friendship between the 3 of them gradually shifted into something more complicated. When Haley and Kevin took one of their breaks, Orlando crossed a line by pursuing Haley romantically. This created tension within their friend group, especially when Orlando's fraternity brothers pushed him out for getting involved with Kevin's girlfriend. The relationship between Haley and Orlando developed into its own on-and-off dynamic. Friends described their interactions as volatile, ranging from hysterical laughter to heated arguments. Sometimes they would avoid each other for weeks. Other times, Orlando would be staying over at Haley's apartment. But according to those closest to the situation, Haley had been crystal clear from the beginning that she didn't want a committed relationship with Orlando. She was focused on finishing school and maintaining her independence. Orlando, however, seemed to have different ideas about where their relationship was heading. Haley's roommate Josie began noticing concerning behavior from Orlando. He would show up at their apartment uninvited, sometimes just to smoke a cigarette on their porch. He would drive by their house repeatedly, and Josie often found herself in the position of having to ask him to leave because Haley found it difficult to be direct with him herself. The red flags became impossible to ignore when jealousy entered the picture. Orlando clearly struggled with the fact that Haley was seeing other people and maintaining her relationship with Kevin. His possessive behavior began escalating in ways that should have been warning signs to everyone involved. Friends described Orlando as charismatic and fun to be around, someone who knew how to make people laugh and enjoy themselves. But beneath that charm was a growing obsession with Haley that became more apparent as time went on. The situation reached a disturbing turning point when Haley's tires were slashed. It happened the day after a party at Orlando's apartment, where he learned that Haley and Kevin were back together. When Haley walked Kevin out to his car the next morning, they discovered the damage. Kevin immediately suspected Orlando, and so did Haley's mother Karen when she heard about the incident. The damage was significant, over $600 worth, which would have made it a felony charge. Despite pressure from her family to file a police report and press charges, Haley refused. She was concerned that a felony conviction would get Orlando kicked out of the nursing program. This decision perfectly illustrated Haley's compassionate nature, but it also demonstrated how Orlando had manipulated her feelings of guilt and sympathy. Friends later revealed that Orlando would often make statements about wanting to harm himself, using emotional manipulation to keep Haley involved in his life even when she tried to distance herself. Despite the tire-slashing incident and the warnings from friends and family, Haley eventually allowed Orlando back into her life. Her trusting nature and genuine care for others made it difficult for her to completely cut ties with someone she had once cared about. The months following the tire incident were marked by this same pattern of Orlando's concerning behavior, followed by Haley's reluctant forgiveness. Her friends watched with growing alarm as the cycle continued, but Haley remained convinced that she could handle the situation. None of them could have predicted how deadly that situation would become. As March 2018 arrived, Haley was focused on her final semester and upcoming graduation. She had been spending time with her roommates, enjoying normal college activities like playing board games and sharing wine on quiet evenings. These were the moments that would later take on profound significance as the last peaceful memories her friends had of her. On the evening of March 7th, Haley had what would be her final normal night with her roommates. They stayed up late together, talking and laughing as college friends do. When they went to bed that night, none of them realized it would be the last time they would see Haley alive. The next morning brought an eerie silence that her roommates initially dismissed. Haley loved to sleep in, so when she didn't respond to text messages right away, no one was immediately concerned. College students often have irregular schedules, and it wasn't unusual for someone to be unreachable for a few hours. But as March 8th wore on with no word from Haley, that initial lack of concern began transforming into genuine worry. By Thursday, March 8th, when Haley failed to show up at poetry night, where she had promised to watch her friend perform, the concern among her circle intensified dramatically. Multiple attempts to reach her by phone went unanswered, which was completely out of character for someone who stayed in constant communication with her friends and family. Her roommates began piecing together the timeline of the previous evening, trying to understand when they had last seen or heard from Haley. The realization that she had been missing for over 24 hours without any contact sent alarm bells ringing through their tight-knit group. Meanwhile, back in Westbury, Karen Anderson remained unaware that anything was wrong. She and Haley had an agreement that they would talk every Sunday, respecting her daughter's independence while maintaining their close relationship. It was still early in the week, so Karen had no reason to suspect that her daughter was in danger. The breakthrough in locating Haley came through modern technology and the quick thinking of her roommates. One of them remembered that Haley had shared her location through the Find My Friends app on her phone. When they checked the app, it showed that Haley's phone was at Orlando's apartment. This discovery shifted the search from a general missing person case to a focused investigation at a specific location. The roommates made the decision to go to Orlando's apartment and see if they could find their friend. When they arrived at the house where Orlando lived, they knocked on all the doors, but received no response. Orlando's car was also missing from the property, which seemed to confirm that no one was home. However, the fact that Haley's phone was showing as being inside the apartment created an urgent need to investigate further. Faced with locked doors and growing fear for their friend's safety, the roommates made the difficult decision to climb through a window to gain entry to the apartment. This wasn't a decision they made lightly, but their concern for Haley outweighed their reservations about entering someone else's home without permission. What they discovered inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The roommate who entered first immediately screamed for the others to call 911. In Orlando's bedroom, they found Haley's lifeless body. She appeared pale and motionless, and even though they hoped against hope that she might still be alive, it was clear that something terrible had happened. The police response was immediate and comprehensive. Within minutes of the 911 call, the house was swarming with officers, investigators, and medical personnel. The scene quickly transformed from a college rental house into an active crime scene. Initial examination revealed that Haley had been strangled to death. The position of her body and the condition of the room suggested that the attack had been intimate and personal. There were no signs of forced entry or robbery, pointing towards someone she knew and trusted. Most significantly, Orlando was nowhere to be found. As investigators began processing the crime scene, they discovered a wealth of evidence that would help them piece together the timeline of events. The house was equipped with multiple security cameras that had captured movements both inside and outside the property. The camera footage revealed a chilling sequence of events that began in the early morning hours of March 8th. The first significant recording showed Haley and Orlando walking into the residence together. This would be the last time Haley was seen alive on any recording. After entering the apartment with Haley, Orlando was captured on camera leaving the residence multiple times over the following hours. However, Haley never appeared on any subsequent footage, suggesting that she never left the apartment after their initial arrival together. The timeline established by the security cameras painted a disturbing picture of Orlando's activities in the hours following Haley's death, rather than immediately calling for help or reporting what had happened. He appeared to be methodically planning his next moves. Investigators tracked Orlando's movements through various pieces of evidence found in his apartment. A receipt led them to a local pharmacy where security footage showed him purchasing sleeping aids, including Zizquil and melatonin. This purchase occurred several hours after Haley's estimated time of death, suggesting he was attempting to cope with what he had done or prepare for his own suicide. The evidence suggested that Orlando returned to his apartment after the pharmacy visit and remained there for approximately 7 more hours. During this time, investigators believe he attempted to take his own life by hanging himself in the basement of the house. Physical evidence supported this theory. Officers found blood on the basement floor and a tie hanging from a doorway, along with hooks that could have been used in a suicide attempt. It appeared that Orlando had tried to hang himself but had fallen and injured himself in the process, explaining the blood evidence. Perhaps most damning was a handwritten note found in the apartment, written in Spanish. The note began with "Lamento mucho esto," which translates to "I'm really sorry about this." Orlando continued by writing that he never felt he could be capable of doing such a thing, and ended with "Father, I'll see you soon," a reference to his deceased father. This note served as both a confession and what appeared to be a suicide note, providing investigators with clear evidence of Orlando's guilt and his mental state following the crime. However, instead of following through with his apparent suicide plan, Orlando made a different choice. Approximately 16 hours before Haley's body was discovered by her roommates, security cameras captured Orlando leaving his apartment one final time, this time carrying luggage, with his head bandaged, likely from his failed suicide attempt. Orlando drove more than 3 hours to New York's JFK Airport. There, he boarded a plane that would take him back to his home country of Nicaragua, where he held dual citizenship. This flight represented Orlando's attempt to escape justice by fleeing to a country where extradition would prove complicated. His dual citizenship status meant that Nicaragua was not required to send him back to the United States to face charges, creating a potential legal nightmare for prosecutors. When District Attorney Steve Cornwell learned that Orlando had successfully fled to Nicaragua before they could arrest him, his first thought was the devastating possibility that a killer might have escaped justice permanently. The complexities of international law and extradition treaties meant that bringing Orlando back to face trial would be far from guaranteed. The case now required coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, international cooperation, and navigation of complex legal frameworks that many local prosecutors rarely encounter. What had begun as a local murder investigation was about to become an international pursuit of justice. Meanwhile, the devastating news of Haley's death reached her family in the most heartbreaking way possible. Karen Anderson was at home when she noticed two men in a black car parked outside her house. When they approached her door and asked to speak with her, she knew immediately that something was terribly wrong. The officers sat her down and delivered the news that no parent ever wants to hear. They told her that Haley had been found dead, that she had been strangled, and that the primary suspect had fled the country. In that moment, Karen's world completely collapsed. The guilt and regret hit her immediately. She remembered the tire-slashing incident and her insistence that Haley should have pressed charges against Orlando. She wondered if her daughter would still be alive if they had taken that threat more seriously, if they had recognized the warning signs for what they truly were. The international hunt for Orlando Tercero intensified as Nicaraguan authorities worked to locate the fugitive. Within days of his flight from New York, Orlando was tracked to his hometown of Chinandega, Nicaragua, where he had been hiding with family members. The political climate in Nicaragua complicated matters, but eventually, local police apprehended him at a hospital where he was receiving treatment for his self-inflicted injuries. A dramatic press conference in Managua showcased Orlando in custody, confirming to the world that he had been captured. However, capturing him was only the beginning of what would become a prolonged legal battle spanning two countries and two very different justice systems. District Attorney Cornwell initially pushed for extradition, hoping to bring Orlando back to New York to face second-degree murder charges. For over a year, diplomatic channels worked to secure his return, but the dual citizenship issue proved insurmountable. Nicaragua's constitution prohibited extraditing its own citizens, regardless of existing treaties with the United States. In September 2019, Cornwell received the call that would change everything. The Department of Justice delivered mixed news. Nicaragua would not extradite Orlando, but they were willing to prosecute him under their own legal system. While this wasn't the outcome anyone had hoped for, it represented Haley's family's only chance at seeing some form of justice. The charges in Nicaragua were different from what Orlando would have faced in New York. Instead of second-degree murder, he was charged with femicide, a specific crime recognizing the murder of women by men with whom they had relationships. This charge carried a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison. What followed was an unprecedented legal proceeding that would test the limits of international cooperation. The entire trial was conducted through video conferencing, with witnesses testifying from the Broome County District Attorney's Office to a courtroom in Managua, thousands of miles away. Karen Anderson became the first witness, finally coming face to face with her daughter's killer through a computer screen. The technology allowed her to see Orlando's reaction as she testified about the warning signs they had all witnessed, his possessive behavior, and the devastating impact of losing Haley. One by one, Haley's friends and roommates shared their stories with the Nicaraguan court. They described Orlando's obsessive behavior, the tire-slashing incident, and his pattern of showing up uninvited at their apartment. The surveillance footage from Orlando's house was presented as evidence, showing the timeline of events that led to Haley's death. The medical examiner's testimony was particularly crucial, establishing that Haley had died from strangulation, with specific injuries consistent with manual compression of her neck. The intimate nature of the attack reinforced the prosecution's argument that this was a crime of passion committed by someone Haley knew and trusted. Orlando's defense team argued that he had been temporarily insane at the time of the murder, claiming he had no memory of the events due to alcohol consumption. They brought in a court-appointed psychiatrist who testified that Orlando claimed to have woken up after a night of heavy drinking to find Haley dead. However, this defense strategy fell apart under scrutiny. There was no evidence that Orlando had been intoxicated to the point of temporary insanity, and the deliberate nature of his actions afterwards suggested clear thinking and planning. The handwritten note he left behind demonstrated his awareness of what he had done. The trial moved swiftly by Nicaraguan standards, concluding after just a few days of testimony. When the judge returned from deliberation after only 90 minutes, everyone was surprised by the speed of the decision. The verdict was unequivocal guilty of femicide. In her sentencing remarks, the judge delivered a powerful statement about violence against women and the importance of recognizing femicide as a serious crime. She noted that Orlando had taken it upon himself to punish Haley for rejecting him, attempting to control her through the ultimate act of violence. Orlando received the maximum sentence of 30 years in prison, a decision that brought some measure of closure to Haley's family and friends. While nothing could bring Haley back, seeing her killer held accountable provided a sense that justice had been served. The case established important precedents for international cooperation in domestic violence cases and highlighted the serious nature of femicide as a distinct crime. It also demonstrated how modern technology, from security cameras to phone tracking apps, can provide crucial evidence in solving murders. For Haley's family, the conclusion of the trial marked the end of one chapter in their grief journey, but the beginning of another focused on healing and honoring her memory. They established initiatives to raise awareness about domestic violence warning signs and the importance of taking threats seriously. Karen Anderson became an advocate for femicide legislation in the United States, hoping that Haley's story might help prevent similar tragedies. She spoke openly about the guilt she carried for not pushing harder for charges after the tire-slashing incident, hoping other families might learn from their experience. The friends who discovered Haley's body continue to carry the trauma of that day, but they also carry forward her memory through their own nursing careers and advocacy work. They remember her as the free-spirited, trusting person who saw good in everyone, even when that trust ultimately betrayed her. Orlando remains imprisoned in Nicaragua's overcrowded penitentiary system, where he will likely spend the next 3 decades. If he ever attempts to return to American soil, he still faces second-degree murder charges in New York State, ensuring that his debt to justice extends far beyond his current sentence. This case serves as a stark reminder that domestic violence warning signs should never be ignored. That obsessive behavior can escalate to deadly violence, and that the people closest to us are sometimes the ones who pose the greatest danger. Haley Anderson's story is ultimately one of a bright future stolen by someone who couldn't accept that love cannot be forced or controlled. Her legacy lives on through the lives she would have saved as a nurse, the awareness her case has raised about femicide, and the determination of those who loved her to ensure that her death has meaning beyond the senseless act that ended her life.